Elementary School, Allegheny Middle School, and Alderdice High School.
It was just after 11 a.m. inside Destiny of Faith Church. Family and friends had gathered to lay 20-year-old John James Hornizes Jr. to rest. The service was quiet, filled with the weight of grief. Then, outside the church doors, that silence broke. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the neighborhood. Mourners screamed and rushed for cover. The funeral, meant to be a final farewell, suddenly collapsed into panic. But even as the panic set in, the worst was yet to come. But this wasn't the first time John's name had been tied to violence. Just days earlier, he had been killed in a shooting at a Pittsburgh gas station. Now, the very people who came to honor him found themselves caught in another attack. Outside, the shots continued. 6 people were injured. What should have been a service of mourning became the scene of an ambush. But why was this funeral targeted? Who carried out the attack? And how could such violence erupt in a place meant for peace? The answers, as investigators would soon uncover, pointed not only to 2 teenagers, but also to a critical failure in police protection that left the mourners vulnerable. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. John James Hornizes Jr. was born in 2002, right in the heart of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His neighborhood shaped him as much as his own family did. To people who didn't know him well, John often came across as quiet. But to those who spent real time with him, he carried a steady kind of presence, someone who made others feel grounded just by being around. Friends described him as calm, but not distant. He had a quiet strength that people leaned on. If you sat next to John, you felt like things would be okay, even if he didn't say a word. One of his biggest passions was basketball. It wasn't just a pastime. It gave his life rhythm and structure. On the court, John wasn't just another teenager from the neighborhood. He was focused, locked in, and alive in a way that showed everyone watching how much the game meant to him. Those who played alongside him said he could spend hours shooting hoops, no matter if it was a packed gym or just the sound of sneakers squeaking and a ball echoing off a backboard. When life felt heavy, the game kept him steady. But basketball wasn't the only way he stood out. John was known for small, quiet acts of kindness that left an impression on people. His cousin once explained it this way: if John had $2 and you had none, now you both had one. That was who he was, the kind of person who would share his last meal or check in on a friend who was struggling, even if he was carrying burdens of his own. John grew up in Pittsburgh's North Side and went to school locally. Like many kids in his community, he tried to stay out of trouble. But that wasn't always easy. Opportunities could be scarce, and the line between survival and danger was often razor thin. He wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes, but the people close to him never doubted where his heart was. The pressures around him were real. Gang activity, neighborhood tensions, people with grudges that lasted longer than anyone expected. Trouble had a way of finding young men in that part of the city, even if they weren't searching for it. Still, his family always believed in him. His mother once told a neighbor, "John's heart is good. He just wants to live right. He just wants peace." That was the tragedy. John didn't set out to be a legend or a hero. He wasn't chasing fame. All he wanted was a fair chance at something better. But that chance was taken from him on October 15th, 2022. That day, John's story was cut short in a sudden burst of violence. And in the days that followed, what began on a city street would spread even further, until it reached the doors of the very church where his family came together to say goodbye. On the morning of October 15th, 2022, nothing seemed unusual. John James Hornizes Jr. had plans to meet up with 2 of his close friends. They chose to gather at the Sunoco gas station on Cedar Avenue, a familiar spot for John. For them, it was just another hangout. They talked, joked, and passed the time the way young men often do, not knowing how quickly that ordinary morning was about to unravel. As they stood outside, an SUV rolled slowly past, and in the next instant, the stillness shattered. Shots rang out from the vehicle. John and his companions responded immediately, exchanging fire in the middle of the street. What began as a sudden attack turned into a shootout, swift, chaotic, and dangerous. But they weren't the only ones caught in the moment. At a nearby bus stop, two women, Betty Averitt and Jacqueline Mahalik, were simply waiting for their ride. In seconds, they were struck down in the crossfire of a conflict that had nothing to do with them. Betty would not survive. For her family and her community, the loss was senseless, an act of violence that arrived without warning and left devastation in its place. People nearby froze in fear. Some dropped to the pavement, others crouched behind cars or hid by gas pumps, hoping the barrage would end. The entire block turned into a scene of confusion and desperation, as if the ordinary rhythm of the city had been torn apart in seconds. In the middle of it all stood John. A round from the SUV struck him, and he fell where he stood. Officers later said his weapon was still beside him. At that moment, John, who only hours earlier had been making casual plans with his friends, became one of 3 fatalities at the scene. Within moments, 911 calls flooded dispatch, reporting gunfire on Cedar Avenue. Responding officers rushed to the station. By the time they arrived, it was no longer just a neighborhood stop for gas. It was a major crime scene. 3 people were dead: John, Betty, and Jacqueline. Detectives immediately began reconstructing what happened. Witnesses were scattered, shaken, and trying to process what they had seen. Surveillance cameras, shell casings, and the accounts of terrified bystanders would all play a role in piecing the sequence together. For investigators, it was clear. The violence of that morning wasn't just about one man, it was part of something larger, something that would soon spill over into the very funeral meant to honor John's life. In the days that followed the gas station shooting, police began making arrests. The first was Chiron Troutman, just 19 years old. Investigators believed he had been inside the SUV during the exchange. He was charged with homicide in connection with the death of John James Hornizes Jr. His arrest marked the first tangible step in what would soon become a far-reaching investigation. But Troutman wasn't the only one facing charges. Jalen Hines, a 21-year-old who had been injured in the shootout while standing beside John, was also arrested. Prosecutors accused him of firing the shots that killed Betty Averitt and Jacqueline Mahalik, the 2 women caught at the bus stop. Suddenly, the picture of that October morning grew even more complex. For the community, the arrests brought mixed emotions. On one hand, there was relief that suspects were being held accountable.
The families of 59-year-old Betty Averitt and 33-year-old Jacqueline Mahalik are one step closer to justice.
This is just so painful.
I'm heartbroken and my soul was empty.
The 2 women were just sitting at a bus stop on Cedar Avenue when a shootout between several people took their lives.
On the other hand, the reality was sobering. Multiple families were now shattered, and the full story of who fired which shots remained tangled in legal proceedings. The puzzle was far from complete. While the courts began to untangle responsibility, John's family faced the rawest part of the tragedy: his sudden absence. They had lost a son, a brother, a cousin, someone whose presence had anchored their lives. All they wanted was a final goodbye, to gather at the church, mourn with dignity, and find some peace in laying him to rest. But peace never came. Instead, the funeral that should have brought closure would erupt into something far worse. The very moment meant to honor John's life would collapse under new gunfire, pushing the family deeper into grief and the community further into fear.
Anybody that would just not take any value in that life is not someone that needs to be on our streets.
City leaders, including Mayor Ed Gainey and Pittsburgh police, say they've seen enough.
I'm tired of seeing mothers crying. I'm tired of seeing people in pain. I'm tired of seeing situations like this.
On some senseless shooting over some argument that automatically ended up in gunplay.
Conflict resolution that's going to be resolved with gunfire is going to result in innocent victims like you see in this particular case. Their lives are cut short for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Respect for life and innocent lives that we've seen. Just over the last several weeks, we've had multiple people not involved in the incident struck by gunfire.
Just 2 weeks after the gas station tragedy, John's family gathered again. This time, at Destiny of Faith Church on Brighton Road. The date was October 28, 2022. The church was filled with more than 100 mourners. They prayed, they wept, and they tried to hold on to the idea that saying goodbye would bring them some peace. The air was heavy with sorrow, but outside, something else was unfolding. At 11:03 a.m., the silence broke. One shot rang out, then another, and within seconds, a burst of gunfire followed. Inside the sanctuary, people ducked, panicked, and scrambled for cover. By 11:04, what had been a solemn service had turned into chaos. Witnesses later said they could hear the rounds striking the church doors. Some dove beneath pews. Others ran, not even sure where to go. The sound of screams mixed with the shots outside. The place that should have been a refuge of faith had been turned into a scene of fear. Surveillance cameras later revealed the attackers. Two figures dressed in dark clothing and masks, later identified as 16-year-old Hezekiah Nixon and 19-year-old Sean Davis, crossed the street toward the church. Footage showed them moving slowly, scanning the building, weapons in hand. They walked with deliberate steps, waited for their moment, and then opened fire on the crowd. Inside the church, people tried to protect each other. Survivors recalled the desperation, their hearts racing, their bodies frozen, their minds trying to process how a funeral could become the next target. One witness said it felt unreal. The very place they had come to grieve had become a second crime scene, but the attackers did not pause. Their shots weren't aimed at any one person in particular. It seemed their only goal was to disrupt the service and spread fear. In that moment, the question wasn't only who was behind it, but why anyone would choose a funeral, of all places, to carry out such violence. However, as the shooting continued outside, calls poured in, reporting gunfire at Destiny of Faith Church. So, within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the neighborhood. Police and medics rushed in, pulling injured victims to safety. Ambulances lined Brighton Road, taking the wounded to nearby hospitals.
After a mass shooting outside a Pittsburgh funeral, AGH president and critical care physician Dr. Amran Quadr briefed reporters on the 5 shooting victims being treated here. He says 4 are in stable condition, 1 in critical condition, and is still undergoing surgery.
We first received an alert at about 12:13, and within 10 minutes we received the patients. There were 5 patients, 1 critical, 4 stable, and we were at level 1 trauma center, and we were ready for the response. We stabilized the patients quickly.
Did each shooting victim suffer multiple gunshot wounds?
I can't give you the details, but some of them, yes.
A little scared, yeah. Then my niece is in there shot, and my great nephew's in there shot.
2 of the victims being treated right now is related to Darnell Harris. He was inside Destiny Faith Church for his great-nephew's funeral, 20-year-old John Hornes, when gunfire erupted.
They was doing service like talking the eulogy or... Eulogy? Yeah, right. They was doing that, and all of a sudden we heard gunfire. They just said gunfire, had to bang on the door, and then all of a sudden you hung gunfire, and everybody started dropping to the floor.
Harris tells me bullets hit 2 of his relatives, his 57-year-old niece and 24-year-old nephew, both standing outside. His niece was shot in the leg, foot, and hand. Her husband drove her to the hospital. Harris is still stunned and is shocked by these shootings.
This is just senseless to me. It's like y'all doing senseless stuff here. You know what I mean? I was born and raised here, but I don't live here no more. But this is just crazy. It's just crazy.
In total, 5 people survived their injuries, but survival did not mean recovery. The community was left traumatized, knowing that a funeral, meant to honor John's memory, had instead added another layer of pain. The peace his family had prayed for was gone. The service had become another headline, another investigation, and another scar for a neighborhood already struggling to heal.
Shots ring out, sending folks scrambling outside Destiny of Faith Church in Brighton Heights. That's what you see on surveillance video from that day last October, as a family was saying their last goodbyes to a loved one. The events caught on camera during the funeral, played in a courtroom Friday afternoon.
As officers processed the aftermath outside Destiny of Faith Church, investigators turned quickly to evidence. The most critical lead came from surveillance cameras mounted on the church and nearby streets. The footage was clear. It showed two masked figures, later identified as Hezekiah Nixon and Sean Davis, walking deliberately toward the building. Minutes later, the same cameras captured them running from the scene and getting into a dark-colored sedan.
Police testified Nixon and Davis took off in a Hyundai near the shooting. They traced the car to an address in McKees Rocks and saw the two come out of the house at that address before stopping them on the McKees Rocks Bridge.
That vehicle, a black sedan, was spotted leaving Brighton Heights immediately after the shooting. Within hours, detectives located it, abandoned not far from the church. The discovery gave them a crucial break. Not only did they have the shooters on video, but now they had the getaway car. From there, police traced the car's route, following it west toward McKees Rocks, a short drive from the crime scene. Officers tightened the search until just a few hours later, they found what they were looking for. Nixon and Davis were in the area, attempting to escape, but their plan quickly fell apart. They got stuck in traffic, unable to outrun patrol units closing in on them. Within seconds, the situation shifted. Officers surrounded the vehicle. The two teenagers tried to run, but there was nowhere left to go. On that street in McKees Rocks, both suspects were taken into custody.
Then the two shooters were seen on video running from the scene. According to the criminal complaint, police determined the suspects ran to a Hyundai Elantra, and they identified the license plate on surveillance video. Just before 6 p.m. Friday, police stopped Nixon and Davis in the vehicle on the McKees Rocks Bridge.
You got two in custody.
In court documents, it says Nixon ran from the vehicle and threw a firearm into the river, and Davis dropped a gun on the roadway.
See if we can get any kind of divers here. We're going to need this weapon.
Now, more than ever, community members are wondering what it will take to stop the violence.
They were immediately charged with attempted homicide, aggravated assault, and multiple firearms violations. Detectives also began reviewing their possible connections to the earlier gas station shootout, linking them not just to one act of violence, but two. The legal consequences they now faced were severe, and the case against them grew by the day.
Attorneys for both Nixon and Davis say you cannot tell who the shooters are in the video. Casey White is representing Nixon.
The individuals who did the shooting are covered in all black, dressed in all black, and they are unidentifiable.
He shared all of this is a lot for his client to unpack as he awaits trial.
You know, he's disappointed with the result. I think he was happy to see that there are a lot of holes in the Commonwealth's case.
The suspects will be back in court in March for their formal arraignment.
But while investigators had their suspects, John's family was left with something no arrest could repair. Grief weighed heavily on them.
Just a few hours later, Pittsburgh police arrested 19-year-old Sean Davis, seen in this mugshot, and 16-year-old Hezekiah Nixon. The teens face charges of attempted homicide, criminal conspiracy, and aggravated assault.
We were standing in the vestibule, and when you turn around, you see the whole front of the church. And you see these people running with these weapons, shooting at other young men.
George Moses, a church trustee, is thankful to be alive.
Fortunately for me, a young woman who I don't know her name pushed me out the way. I fell on the ground.
Court documents detail how surveillance video shows two males walking towards the church holding guns with extended magazines. The criminal complaint says one of the suspects could be seen firing shots towards the front of the church, and the other suspect fired multiple shots at one of the victims on the sidewalk and chased the victim while firing a gun. The complaint says a horse that was used to pull a carriage holding a casket appeared to be struck by gunfire. The horse was hit by multiple bullet fragments. The shooting lasted for less than a minute.
For John's family, the fear of retaliation had always been present. In the days before the funeral, they voiced those concerns openly. They even filed a formal request for police presence, worried that the tensions around his death could erupt again. But on the morning of the service, no officers were there. The request had gone unanswered. And when the gunfire broke out, the absence of protection made the tragedy even harder to accept. Their fears had become reality.
Joins us live. And Rick, I understand you just learned that the police officers that were requested by the church were not there.
Yeah, that's right, Lisa. Multiple family members here outside the hospital were telling me this afternoon that police officers were supposed to be at that funeral, but they say no one ever showed up. Now, I did speak with a law enforcement source just a short time ago. They confirmed that two Pittsburgh police officers were assigned to that detail. But those officers at the very last minute were pulled for another assignment. After completing that other assignment, those officers planned to return to the funeral, and that's when the shots were fired and the shooting broke out. Again, my source telling me it's not normal procedure for Pittsburgh police officers to attend these funerals, but they suspect there was somebody anticipating possible trouble at that site, and that's why those officers may have been requested in the first place. Again, those officers pulled for another assignment, and then they were going back to the church, and when they were on their way back, the shooting happened.
At the center of the city's response stood Mayor Ed Gainey. His words carried both grief and frustration. "This is senseless. This cannot be our future," he said in a public statement, urging Pittsburgh to confront its cycle of violence with urgency. But words, however heartfelt, could not undo the damage. For the families left behind, the scars would last far longer than the news coverage.
Police believe the shooting was targeted. Sources tell KDKA those connected to the funeral victim fired shots at rivals in the Spring Hill neighborhood. And today may have been the latest retaliation in an escalating war.
We believe there's a dispute going on. We're looking into that. We're going to utilize all the resources as we have been doing currently, and we'll continue to do so. There will be a strong police presence in the areas of concern.
Mayor Ed Gainey arrived on the scene looking at the damage along Brighton Road, including cars littered with bullet holes.
We need to make sure that this never happens again. And we will be working around the clock to do whatever's necessary to apprehend those that did this heinous thing today.
That you would come into or come around the church and shoot up.
I just think these young boys don't care about anybody's life, not even their own.
The call for change echoed across Pittsburgh. People spoke of breaking the cycle, of finding a way to stop the violence before it reached yet another home, another family, another funeral. But the path forward remained uncertain. For John's family and for the community that gathered in grief, the questions lingered. How many more lives would be lost before something changed? And what would it take to prevent another tragedy like this one? As of now, the trials are still moving forward. Neither Sean Davis nor Hezekiah Nixon has been fully sentenced for the funeral shooting. The courts continue to weigh their futures, while John's family is still left searching for peace. What do you think should happen in cases like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to know how this trial ends and whether justice is finally delivered, make sure you stay tuned. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this story isn't over yet.
I wanted to believe it was a clothes bin of clothes. I really didn't want to believe it was a body. Your heart races. Your heart races.
It started with a single phone call. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, a resident in New Britain, Connecticut, noticed something odd: a man struggling to move a large plastic bin behind an abandoned house on Clark Street. It wasn't the kind of thing that normally drew attention, but something about the way he hurried made the neighbor uneasy. They picked up the phone and called 911. When officers arrived, they expected to find illegal dumping or vandalism. The house had been empty for months, but as they stepped behind the property, what they discovered would unravel a year of silence that no one had questioned. Inside that heavy plastic bin were the remains of a child, carefully hidden, left to be forgotten. And as investigators worked to identify her, they realized something almost impossible. She had been missing for nearly a year, and not one person had reported her gone. Her name was Jacqueline Torres Garcia, 12 years old. Every safeguard designed to protect her, family, schools, social workers, had failed. No one noticed when she stopped showing up to class. No one asked when her mother said she was being homeschooled. But the case was not as simple as a mother and a missing child, because what investigators uncovered next revealed a chain of decisions, cover-ups, and missed warnings that stretched far beyond one family. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. When officers arrived at 80 Clark Street on that chilly October afternoon in 2025, the neighborhood was unusually still. The two-story house had sat empty for years. It belonged to a landlord in New York who hadn't set foot in Connecticut for over 2 years. and most residents had stopped paying it any attention. But that day, something about the scene drew everyone's eyes. A large plastic storage bin rested awkwardly behind the house, half hidden beneath a sheet of tarp, and the faint smell coming from it made the responding officers step back before lifting the lid. What they found inside would change the course of the entire investigation. The bin held the remains of a young girl, and although time and decay had made identification difficult, the detectives could already sense this was not a recent death. The condition of the remains suggested that she had been gone for many months, perhaps close to a year. So the house that neighbors thought was empty had been quietly holding a terrible secret, and the officers who first looked inside that bin would later say the memory never left them. The area was quickly sealed off with yellow tape as investigators from the New Britain Police Department and the State Police Major Crimes Division arrived to process the scene. By that evening, the New Britain Mayor, Aaron Stewart, stood before reporters. "As a mother, this makes me sick to my stomach to stand here and tell you what we've found." The mayor thanked the anonymous caller who had reported the suspicious activity, stressing that without that person's courage, the child might have remained undiscovered for much longer. Detectives echoed her sentiment, calling it one of the most distressing cases the city had seen in more than 3 decades. Forensic testing moved quickly. Dental records and DNA samples were compared against missing child databases, and within days the results confirmed what investigators had quietly feared. The remains belonged to Jacqueline Mimi Torres Garcia, a 12-year-old girl who, according to school and welfare records, should have been living with her mother in nearby Farmington. But when detectives checked, they found no active missing person report under her name, not locally, not statewide, not anywhere. And so the questions began to multiply. How could a child vanish for nearly a year without anyone raising an alarm? Why had no one noticed her absence at school, in her neighborhood, or even within her own family? The discovery on Clark Street had answered one question, where she was, but it had opened a dozen more about how she got there.
She was tied up on a pee pad was one of the things I believe that they talked about, and it's just we don't see this on the news all the time. This is a really unusual, heinous case.
Yeah, that's the most difficult part about this, right? Like, I mean, we deal with every day. You know, the news is reporting about somebody who was killed in a car accident. Somebody maybe. You know, there was a domestic issue. You know, and there was an assault, or you know, there's all these. I think it takes it to another level when you see that parents starve their child to death and then didn't report.
But to understand how a 12-year-old could disappear in plain sight and no one noticed, investigators had to trace her story backward, to a family already known to the system. Jacqueline Torres Garcia was born in 2012 in New Britain, Connecticut, a small, working-class city where neighbors often knew each other by name and families tended to stay close. Those who remembered her early years said she was a gentle child, shy but cheerful, the kind of girl who loved coloring books and carried her stuffed animals everywhere. But her first years of life were marked by instability long before anyone could imagine what would happen later. When Jacqueline was just an infant, her mother, Carla Garcia, was detained in 2013, and the Connecticut Department of Children and Families, DCF, stepped in to assume temporary custody. The agency placed the newborn with her paternal relatives, and soon her grandmother, Patricia Delgado, became her legal guardian through the Superior Court for Juvenile Matters. Delgado's home became the only stable environment the little girl knew. It was where she took her first steps, attended preschool, and grew surrounded by cousins, neighbors, and church members who knew her simply as Mimi. By August 2013, DCF closed its case, noting that Mimi was safe and thriving under her grandmother's care. But as the years passed, the agency would reappear at the family's door more than once. Between 2014 and 2017, new reports surfaced, not about Mimi, but about her younger siblings, prompting DCF to reopen investigations intermittently. Each time, the agency documented its visits, confirmed the children were unharmed, and moved on. To outsiders, it looked as though the system was functioning as it should. Through these years, Patricia Delgado provided her granddaughter with structure, school attendance, after-school activities, birthday gatherings, and a sense of belonging. Teachers described Mimi as quiet and polite, the kind of student who always raised her hand before speaking. But the peace didn't last. By 2016, tension between Delgado and Carla Garcia began to surface. Carla wanted her daughter back, arguing that she was stable and ready to parent again. Delgado, who had seen Carla's temper and her financial struggles, resisted the idea, insisting that the little girl was better off where she was. The disagreement grew into a custody lawsuit, setting the stage for a long and painful family conflict. Over time, Carla Garcia began rebuilding her life, finding housing, securing temporary work, and re-establishing contact with Jacqueline's father, Victor Torres. By 2022, the parents jointly petitioned the court to regain guardianship of both Jacqueline and her younger sibling. DCF reviewed the family's file, interviewed the parents, and assessed their ability to provide care. By June 2024, Carla Garcia had finally regained what she had fought for years to achieve: full legal custody of her daughter, Jacqueline Mimi Torres Garcia. The court granted her sole guardianship after a brief hearing that lasted less than 10 minutes. No one from the Department of Children and Families, DCF, was present that day, and there was no mention of Carla's criminal record or the family's history with the agency. On paper, the case appeared routine, a simple custody transition from a grandmother to a rehabilitated mother. But for Jacqueline, it marked the beginning of her gradual disappearance. Over that summer, Carla moved her children from New Britain to a small apartment in Farmington, a quieter town about 15 miles away. To neighbors, the family seemed private but unremarkable: a woman, her boyfriend, and 2 children who mostly stayed indoors. What no one outside the apartment knew was that this relocation also severed the last connections between Jacqueline and the world that had once kept her visible. Then, on August 26, 2024, Carla Garcia filed a formal notice with the New Britain School District to withdraw Jacqueline from public school. She stated that she intended to homeschool her daughter, citing relocation and personal preference. Teachers noted the withdrawal but had no legal grounds to question it. For the educators who had taught Jacqueline through 5th grade, the decision was unexpected but not unusual. Families moved often, and homeschooling had become increasingly common. Meanwhile, Victor Torres, Jacqueline's father, continued to reach out. He had fought for years to stay part of his daughter's life, filing motions and sending messages asking to see her on weekends, as their joint custody agreement had allowed. But after June 2024, his calls went unanswered, his court filings ignored. He wrote in frustration that he only wanted to visit his children any day for that matter, yet each request was quietly deflected. By early autumn, neighbors in Farmington noticed that they rarely saw Jacqueline outside, and within weeks of that withdrawal, Jacqueline would disappear behind closed doors, and nobody outside the house would ever see her alive again. According to police warrants, the home became a place of control and punishment, where Carla Garcia, the same mother who had once pleaded for a second chance, began to enforce her authority in ways that would ultimately end her daughter's life. Investigators would later learn that Carla had begun restricting her food as a form of discipline, convinced that her daughter was acting out and needed to be corrected. In her statement to police, Carla admitted that she stopped feeding Jacqueline 2 weeks before she died. She claimed it was punishment, a way to make the girl behave. It was during this time that Jonathan Nanita, Carla's boyfriend, became more involved in what he called discipline. Witness accounts and text exchanges retrieved from their phones showed that Nanita not only knew about the starvation, but participated in it, helping Carla restrain Jacqueline using zip ties whenever she talked back or tried to move around the apartment. The family's routine had turned into a system of disguised as control. Jacqueline's aunt, Jacqueline Garcia, visited often during this period. She saw her niece lying on pee pads on the floor, her wrists bound, unable to move freely. Investigators would later recover photos and messages from Jacqueline's phone, images she had sent to Carla, showing Jacqueline restrained and motionless. These images would become some of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the entire case. When detectives confronted Carla with the evidence, she tried to explain that she had been overwhelmed, that she didn't mean for things to go that far. But her sister's words painted a much clearer picture. During questioning, Jacqueline told investigators, "I knew she was going to die." She had seen Jacqueline's condition deteriorate and done nothing to stop it. There were no recent physical injuries, no visible trauma that could directly explain her death. But the investigators determined that September 19th, 2024 was the likely date Jacqueline died. She was just 12 years old. Afterward, Carla and Jonathan didn't call for help, didn't report the death, and didn't tell anyone what had happened. Instead, they hid her body in the basement of the apartment, and yet for the next 12 months, her name never appeared on a missing person list. Then came January 2025. A new concern surfaced, not about Jacqueline, but about her younger sibling. A DCF caseworker reached out to Carla Garcia to schedule a welfare check. During that visit, Carla explained that Jacqueline was being homeschooled and was currently out of state with a relative. The caseworker, trying to confirm the story, requested to see the girl, even if only through a video call. What happened next revealed how fragile the state's oversight had become. When the call began, a child appeared on screen, but it was not Jacqueline. Investigators later confirmed that Carla had arranged for another girl to pose as her daughter during the call. The child smiled, waved, and responded when addressed as Mimi. There was no way for the caseworker, watching through a small screen, to know the truth. In the official case log, DCF noted no visible concerns. The family appeared stable, cooperative, and safe.
New development released by DCF tonight. In January this year, the department was investigating concerns into Jacqueline's sister. Jacqueline, according to police, had been dead for multiple months, but officials had no idea. So when DCF came asking questions, Jacqueline's mother, Carla Garcia, allegedly said Jacqueline was being homeschooled and was out of state. But DCF wanted to conduct a video call with Jacqueline to make sure she was okay. In a shocking allegation, DCF claims Carla Garcia had a different child pretend to be Jacqueline on a video call to calm DCF's concerns. DCF also says it provided services to Jacqueline's family from 2014 to 2016 and briefly in 2017 and 2021. We've learned Jacqueline attended 3 medical appointments this decade, and DCF didn't receive any reports of child.
So by March 2025, the file was once again closed. No home visit was scheduled, no questions were asked about the missing school records, and no one thought to verify that Jacqueline even existed within the household. And by March 2025, Carla Garcia packed up what was left of her family's life in Farmington and moved them back to New Britain. Among the boxes and furniture was a large plastic storage bin, the same one detectives would later find behind an abandoned house on Clark Street. Inside it, hidden beneath blankets and plastic liners, was Jacqueline's.
Body cams captured police arriving after a noise complaint at a condo in Farmington on December 29th last year. Little did they know at that time, it's believed the body of Jacqueline Torres Garcia was allegedly hidden in the basement.
Is everything okay?
Yeah.
We got a call. There's a lot of noise coming from your apartment.
They're always calling.
Carla Garcia, the girl's mother, and her boyfriend, Jonathan Anita, chalked the noise up to Garcia being pregnant and moody. Both are now charged with murder after police believe they allegedly starved the 11-year-old to death.
Is this your only daughter? You guys got the
One on the way. I have a son.
Son's
upstairs. He's 1. Oh, he just turned 2. I'm sorry.
Keep you guys busy.
Oh yeah.
There is no mention of Jacqueline, who allegedly had been dead for several months at the time of this call.
The officers were not there to check how many people were there. They were there on a noise complaint, so they did not have the luxury of having that information that that the numbers did not add up.
How long you guys been staying here?
Almost a year.
Officers carried on a conversation, asked questions, and took down the couple's personal information. There's no mention of strange smells. Eventually, the odor from the decaying body was apparently so strong that Garcia allegedly later confessed they had to stay with friends and at hotels. In the officers' report, they noted there was no signs of fighting.
Now, had they asked for a consent search, they may have discovered her body down in the basement there, but they were not suspicious enough. They were not given information enough to rise to the level of requesting a consent search of the apartment.
By the night of October 12, 2025, the search for answers had turned into a string of arrests. Detectives from both Farmington and New Britain police departments tracked Carla Garcia to a relative's home and took her into custody without incident. Her sister, Jacqueline Garcia, was arrested moments later. Both women appeared calm, almost resigned, as they were escorted into patrol cars. The next day, October 13th, officers located Jonathan Nanita, Carla's boyfriend, who had been hiding at a friend's apartment. When he was brought out, cameras captured his face, marked with minor bruising, likely from the brief scuffle during arrest. He avoided eye contact with reporters and said nothing as officers led him into the waiting cruiser.
According to the arrest warrants for Nanita, Carla Garcia, and Carla's sister, Jacqueline Garcia, we learned where Mimi died, how police say Carla and Nanita changed their stories, and what a doctor believes was Mimi's cause of death. According to those documents, Carla initially stated she had an argument with Mimi. Carla said Mimi was upset her mom was pregnant again and pushed her down the stairs, which caused both of them to fall down. Carla later stated Nanita got upset and kicked Mimi in the head and dragged her off. Garcia stated she never saw her daughter again. On the other hand, Nanita's statement described a different story. He stated that he was homeless at the time and that Carla had contacted him to help dispose the toad. He stated that he saw blood on the walls and that Carla said not to worry about it. The document says Nanita tried to dispose the toad at various locations until he placed it on 80 Clark Street in New Britain.
Prosecutors outlined the charges soon after. Carla Garcia, the child's mother, faced murder with special circumstances, conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence, and intentional cruelty to a child under 19, each charge carrying the weight of a system's failure. Her bond was set at $5 million. Her sister, Jacqueline Garcia, was charged with cruelty to a person under 19 and unlawful restraint, accused of witnessing the neglect and doing nothing to stop it. Her bond stood at $1 million. Jonathan Nanita faced the same murder with special circumstances charge as Carla, along with tampering with physical evidence, also set at $5 million. Police believed he helped move Jacqueline's body from Farmington to New Britain and played a direct role in concealing her death.
Well, tonight, the story continues to develop in New Britain, where the body of 11-year-old Jacqueline Torres Garcia was found behind a home nearly 1 week ago. Thanks for joining us for the Fox 61 News at 10. I'm Brent Harden.
And I'm Sarah Sanchez. It was an emotional day in court. The 3 people charged in connection to Jacqueline's death went before a judge.
Her mother, Carla Garcia, and Carla's boyfriend, Jonathan Nanita, are both charged with murder with special circumstances and risk of injury to a child. They're both being held on a $5 million bond. Also in court, Jacqueline's aunt, who faces charges of unlawful restraint and cruelty. Her bond is set at $1 million.
Authorities say the child died in the fall of 2024 after prolonged abuse and malnutrition. Her body was reportedly moved from Farmington to New Britain. Loved ones had to be removed from the courtroom because of emotional outbursts today, and many family members wore shirts with Jackie's face on them. The suspects are due back in court.
As details emerged, reporters pressed for more. How long had they known, and who had helped? Behind the scenes, detectives are working through hundreds of pages of phone records, financial transactions, and interviews, trying to understand how 3 adults had maintained a secret this dark for nearly a year. But that's not all. Reporters soon uncovered records that painted a far more troubling picture. In 2019, Carla Garcia had been charged in a domestic assault case involving a former partner, a conviction that went largely unnoticed in later custody proceedings. Her sister, Jacqueline Garcia, had also been arrested in 2023 after taking her infant to a hospital with multiple unexplained fractures. She eventually pled guilty to risk of injury to a child and served part of a 10-year sentence, most of it suspended. Critics questioned how a woman with such a record was later allowed unsupervised contact with another child. For many, Jacqueline's death symbolized every warning unheeded, every visit that ended too soon, every note marked "case closed" when it shouldn't have been. And out of that collective anger and grief came something else, a petition and the beginnings of a new proposal that would carry Jacqueline's own nickname. In the weeks that followed the arrests, grief began to turn into movement. In Bridgeport, a father named Los Fidel started an online campaign calling for change. He was neither a politician nor an activist, just a parent who couldn't understand how a child could vanish for a year without a single person checking in. He called his proposal Mimi's Law, after the nickname friends and family had given to Jacqueline Torres Garcia. Within days, his petition began circulating across the state. By late October 2025, it had gathered more than 12,000 signatures, each one representing another voice demanding accountability. Fidel's plan is simple but direct: mandatory in-person welfare checks for homeschooled children, body cameras for DCF caseworkers and residency restrictions for convicted child abuse, ensuring they could never again live in households with minors. He described it as a safeguard for children who disappear quietly. Parents, teachers, and even lawmakers began to rally behind it. Community groups held vigils in New Britain, where candles lined the steps of City Hall spelling out the word Mimi. For many residents, this proposed law became a way to give meaning to a story that had seemed too painful to face. By the end of the month, legislators from both parties had publicly voiced support. Committee drafts began circulating in Hartford, and local representatives promised that Mimi's law would be prioritized in the next legislative session. News outlets called it a rare moment of unity born out of tragedy, as even those long critical of state oversight agreed that reform was overdue. Now we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have changed the outcome of this case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them because every perspective matters. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.
To the emergency. Yes. My son just called me, and he told me he died in North Carolina. He killed his baby, and he's in the house. Okay, you said that he told you he killed his baby. Okay, ma'am, listen to...
When the phone rang that morning, Grace Plattle didn't hesitate to answer. Her son called often, usually with small talk about the baby or errands he planned to run. But this time, it was different. Mom, I killed the baby. There was a pause so long she thought the line had gone dead. Then he added quietly, I'm on my way to New York. Grace's knees gave out before she could reach the chair. She tried to keep him talking, tried to make sense of what she was hearing, but Stephen's tone never changed. He spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if nothing she could say would matter anymore. She hung up and dialed 911 with shaking hands, barely forming the words. My son just called me. He said he killed his baby, and he's on his way to New York. The baby he was referring to was his own son. A child born from a relationship no mother could ever comprehend. Not between strangers, but between Stephen and his biological daughter, Katie. While dispatchers scrambled to trace the call, police across 3 states were already moving. They didn't know yet what they were walking into, only that time was running out. And by the time officers reached the address Grace had given, the house was silent. The front door was locked, a key left neatly under the mat. Inside waited the first piece of a tragedy that would span 3 states and end 3 lives. A secret buried for nearly 2 decades had finally erupted into daylight. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Stephen Plattle had never been the kind of young man people easily understood. In the mid-1990s, he lived with his mother, Grace, in Levittown, New York, spending long hours alone in his room, tinkering with old electronics and studying gun magazines. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, sometimes polite, but withdrawn and unpredictable. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it never reached his eyes. Grace often described him as different, a boy who grew into a man with a temper that could turn from calm to furious in seconds. And hundreds of miles away in San Antonio, Texas, a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa Garcia was growing up in a very different world. She was bright, curious, and outspoken, but like many teenagers discovering the early days of the internet, she often went online to escape the strict boundaries of home. In 1995, those chat rooms where people could pretend to be anyone and say anything without consequence, that was where Stephen found her. They began messaging almost every night, sharing stories about music, family, and frustration. For Alyssa, it felt like attention, a young man who seemed to listen. For Stephen, it became an obsession. He was 20, but he convinced himself he had met someone who finally understood him. Their conversations turned from friendly to intimate, and within months, Stephen was planning to visit her in person. When he finally made the trip from New York to Texas, it was not a casual visit. He arrived as if he had already decided that Alyssa was his. Her parents were furious, warning her that she was still but love, especially for a teenage girl desperate to be seen, often silences warnings. And so, against her family's wishes, Alyssa stayed close to him. By 16, she was pregnant. She tried to believe Stephen would change, that the anger she sometimes saw was just stress or fear. But it grew worse. He couldn't keep a job, and when money became tight, the arguments began to fill every room. Alyssa remembered the way his anger worked, quick, loud, and violent. He punched walls, broke furniture, and then, when she tried to leave, he would apologize through tears and threats. He'd say if I ever left, he'd film himself ending it, Alyssa later recalled. He wanted me scared enough to stay. When their baby girl was born in early 1998, they named her Denise. For a brief moment, Alyssa hoped the child might soften him, that fatherhood might bring out something gentle. But instead, Stephen's control deepened. He treated the baby like property, not a person. Alyssa noticed bruises she couldn't explain, and moments when he would silence the crying by closing the door and walking away. Sometimes she heard nothing for minutes, and when she opened the door, she would find him hovering over the crib, cold and impatient. It didn't take long before fear replaced love entirely. Alyssa began to understand that if she stayed, the baby would not be safe. She tried to think of every way out, and none of them seemed possible until she realized there was only one decision left. 8 months after giving birth, Alyssa handed her daughter to an adoption agency, hoping that somewhere out there, a safer family existed. It was the only way to keep her alive, she said quietly years later. And that was how Denise became Katie, a name chosen by her new parents, Anthony and Kelly Fusco, a loving couple from Dover, New York. They took the infant home, unaware of the darkness she had narrowly escaped, and began raising her in the safety of a quiet neighborhood surrounded by woods and long, open roads. As the Fuscos rocked her to sleep in their small living room, they had no idea that the people who had given her life would one day take it away. For nearly 18 years, Katie Fusco lived the kind of quiet, ordinary life that most people in small-town New York only dreamt of. Dover Plains was the kind of place where neighbors waved across lawns, where weekends meant local fairs, and where the world beyond seemed comfortably far away. Anthony and Kelly Fusco had given their adopted daughter everything they could: stability, affection, and a sense of belonging. They had rescued her not just from danger, but into a home where she was loved simply for being herself. Katie grew up surrounded by warmth and laughter. Her childhood was filled with art projects taped to the refrigerator and half-finished sketchbooks stacked beside her bed. She was curious and endlessly creative, and even as a little girl, she found beauty in things that others overlooked. When her classmates would chase dogs away from the schoolyard, Katie would kneel down to feed them bits of her lunch. Stray cats followed her home, and soon her parents' garage became an unofficial shelter. Kelly's brother, Carrie, used to call her Pac-Man because she was always snacking, a running family joke that Katie wore proudly. She was a vegetarian from an early age, not because someone told her to be, but because she couldn't stand the idea of hurting an animal. Her empathy seemed effortless, as if it was part of her design. As she grew older, that same sensitivity found a new outlet in art. Katie carried a sketchbook everywhere she went. In high school, she spent hours drawing comic strips that her teachers sometimes posted on bulletin boards. And when the school introduced a strict dress code, she was the one who started a small student petition. Not out of rebellion, but because she believed everyone should feel comfortable in their own skin. She played the drums in her school's band and found peace in rhythm and motion. In a blog post she wrote at 16, she described how art became her anchor during times when words felt heavy. "A pen and something to draw on became a safe place for me," she wrote. "Ink became my weapon against rules and regulations. For me, a life without art is no life at all." Those who knew her said she had the kind of personality that made everyone else feel at ease. Friendly but thoughtful, ambitious but grounded. She talked often about college and wanted to study digital advertising or illustration. She imagined herself working for a creative agency one day, designing visuals that would inspire others the way art had always inspired her. Anthony and Kelly supported her every step, never pressuring her to choose a certain path, just encouraging her to stay true to herself. To anyone looking in, it was a life defined by simplicity and love, the kind of beginning that promised a bright future. But on her 18th birthday, curiosity began to stir. Katie had always known she was adopted. Her parents had told her when she was old enough to understand, and she never resented them for it. Still, as she crossed that threshold into adulthood, something inside her wanted answers about where she came from, about the people who had given her up, and about the story that had started long before she was old enough to remember. And so, without realizing it, she began to reopen a door that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades, a door that would lead her back to the man who was never supposed to be part of her life again. So one night, she opened her laptop, logged into Facebook, and within hours of searching, she found them, Stephen and Alyssa Plattel, her biological parents. Their profiles were simple, a family living in Virginia, with photos of 2 younger girls, and at the time, what looked like a stable home. It seemed harmless, even hopeful. Katie sent a message, and within days, they began talking. Then the messages turned into late-night calls, and before long, they all agreed to meet in person. That meeting happened in August 2016, and for Katie, it felt like a long-awaited reunion, a missing chapter of her life finally found. She decided to stay with them for a while in Henrico County, Virginia, a quiet suburban area that promised comfort and space. However, once Katie moved in, the picture-perfect reunion began to change. Alyssa, who had spent years living under Stephen's unpredictable moods, noticed a familiar tension creeping back into the house. She and Stephen had already been sleeping in separate rooms for months, and conversations that started calmly often ended in shouting. She hoped Katie wouldn't notice, but in that small home, nothing stayed hidden for long. Still, Katie's presence seemed to give Stephen new life. He started dressing differently. Tight shirts, fitted jeans, his once graying beard trimmed to a fashionable stubble. He even let his hair grow longer, and he smiled more often, though not always for the right reasons. Alyssa watched him closely, noticing the way his attention shifted, how he lingered when Katie spoke, and how his mood changed when she wasn't around. Then came the moment that made everything unravel. One night, Stephen decided to sleep on the floor of Katie's room. Alyssa walked in, stunned, and demanded to know what he was doing. He didn't even look embarrassed. "It's none of your business," he snapped. That was when she knew something was terribly wrong. She tried to warn Katie, tried to explain the kind of man Stephen was, the temper, the control, the manipulation, but Katie wouldn't listen. And in November 2016, Alyssa finally filed for divorce. She packed her things, gathered her 2 younger daughters, and walked out of that house for good. For years she had feared Stephen's anger, but leaving him felt like the only way to protect what was left of her family. Stephen didn't try to stop her. Instead, he stood in the doorway, watching as the car disappeared down the street. And something in his expression shifted. Because for Stephen, Alyssa leaving wasn't a loss, it was an opening. The months that followed Alyssa's departure only deepened the divide between what was normal and what was unthinkable. Stephen and Katie now lived alone in the same house, and without anyone there to set boundaries, the father-daughter bond that began as affection began to twist into something darker. He told his 2 younger daughters during weekend visits that Katie was special and that they needed to respect her. But when one of them asked how she should address her older sister, Stephen didn't hesitate, and he said, "Call her stepmom." It was more than disturbing. It was a line no one imagined could ever be crossed, and soon, Alyssa would see just how far he had gone. In May 2017, Alyssa found her 11-year-old daughter's journal left open on her bed. Inside, written in the innocent handwriting of a child, was a line that made her blood run cold. "My dad calls her baby his baby. My dad says she's my stepmom." There were drawings too. One of her father with horns, labeled simply, "The Devil." Alyssa's hands trembled as she turned the pages, each one confirming what she already feared but didn't want to believe. Stephen wasn't just controlling Katie. He was in a full-blown relationship with her. And now, somehow, she was pregnant. Alyssa's mind raced. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number, unable to contain the fury and disbelief. When he picked up, she didn't wait for him to speak. "You got her pregnant?" she shouted. "I thought you knew," he said. "We're in love." It was a sentence that would replay in Alyssa's head for years, not because of what it revealed, but because of how easily he said it. Alyssa hung up and immediately contacted the police. She filed a report explaining everything: the journal, the confession, the pregnancy. Detectives opened an investigation, but since both Stephen and Katie were adults under the law and no immediate evidence of coercion was found, no arrests were made. It was one of those legal gray areas that seemed impossible to comprehend. A biological father and daughter, openly declaring themselves as lovers, and the system frozen by the technicalities of consent. Meanwhile, Stephen and Katie packed their belongings and left Virginia. They moved to Knightdale, North Carolina, settling into a quiet suburban home with Stephen's mother, Grace. To the outside world, they appeared to be an unconventional couple, not a father and daughter, just two adults starting a new chapter. Neighbors saw them together on walks, hand in hand, never suspecting the truth. Inside that house, the illusion became reality. They set up a nursery, prepared for their baby's arrival, and told anyone who asked that they were married in spirit, if not yet by law. They didn't hide it anymore. They believed love made it right. But the law, and the world around them, would soon say otherwise. By the summer of 2017, what had started as a family reunion had turned into something far more disturbing. Stephen was 42 and Katie was just 20, but they no longer hid what they were. On July 20th, 2017, the two of them drove quietly across state lines into Maryland, and with their marriage license, they simply lied, declaring that they were unrelated. There was no investigation, no questions asked, just paperwork and signatures. What made it even more unsettling was that both of their mothers attended. Grace Pladel stood beside her son, her expression fixed in uneasy silence, while Kelly and Anthony Fusco, Katie's adoptive parents, watched with heartbreak and confusion, unsure how to stop a union that should never have happened. The photos from that day showed polite smiles, awkward hands, and forced acceptance. The kind of moment where everyone knew it was wrong, but no one knew what to do. After the brief ceremony, Katie posted a photo on social media, a simple image of her in a cream dress beside Stephen. The caption read, "Nothing fancy, just love." To those scrolling past, it looked like any young couple's wedding announcement, but for those who knew the truth, it was a nightmare disguised as normalcy. 2 months later, in September 2017, Katie gave birth to a baby boy they named Bennett. Stephen called him a miracle. "Our second chance at family," he told a neighbor. And for a time, their home in Knightdale, North Carolina, looked like any other. From the outside, life seemed calm, but inside, though, Stephen's obsession deepened. He watched Katie constantly, controlled where she went, and called her phone when she was gone too long. By January 2018, the illusion of normalcy had started to crack. Whispers were spreading, and what had once been kept behind closed doors was beginning to surface in official records. Law enforcement in Virginia had quietly reopened the file Alyssa Pladel had made months earlier, the one about her ex-husband and their daughter. And this time, investigators had evidence they couldn't ignore. On a cold morning that month, both Stephen and Katie Pladel were arrested and charged with incest, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The charges were issued out of Henrico County, Virginia, and officers from Knightdale, North Carolina, carried out the arrest at the quiet suburban home they shared. Neighbors later said police cars lined the area for hours, but no one understood why. It wasn't until the story hit the news that the horrifying truth came out. The couple next door weren't just husband and wife, they were father and daughter. The two were extradited to Virginia and processed separately. Katie appeared frightened and quiet during booking, her hair tied back and eyes lowered, while Stephen remained expressionless, almost calm, as if the gravity of the situation hadn't reached him yet. They both posted bond shortly afterward and were released, but under strict court orders, no contact of any kind. They were forbidden from seeing or speaking to each other while the case was pending. Their infant son, Bennett, was placed in the custody of Stephen's mother, Grace Pladel, in Cary, North Carolina. She had always tried to believe her son's version of events, that it was love, not manipulation, but even she struggled to make sense of it all. Outside the courthouse, Stephen's attorney, Rick Friedman, spoke to reporters. His comments shocked nearly everyone who heard them. "This case is about two adults who fell in love," he said. "They never knew each other for 18 years. The fact that they were biologically related never appeared to be an issue for them." His words ignited outrage. Online forums, radio shows, and television panels erupted with disbelief. Many saw the statement as a cruel distortion, a defense that erased years of control. For Alyssa, who had warned everyone that Stephen was dangerous, it felt like a second betrayal. After her release, Katie left North Carolina and returned to New York to live with her adoptive parents, Tony and Kelly Fusco. She was emotionally drained, ashamed, and trying to rebuild her life. Her parents welcomed her back without hesitation, determined to help her heal. But the scars ran deep. For the first time since reconnecting with her biological father, Katie began to see him as he truly was. Not a man who loved her, but a man who had shaped her life through deception and distance, finally brought clarity. And as she tried to restart her life, Stephen won't let her go easily, because for Stephen, separation wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much darker. Katie started therapy and began reconnecting with old friends. For the first time, she saw herself not as a lover, but as a victim. So one evening in early April 2018, she picked up the phone and made the call that Stephen had always feared. "I can't do this anymore," she told him. "It's over." But that single call broke whatever fragile stability he had left. In the days that followed, Stephen withdrew completely. He stopped answering texts from his mother, ignored calls from his attorney, and spent hours alone in the darkened house in Knightdale, North Carolina. Bottles began to pile up near his recliner, and neighbors would later say they rarely saw him step outside. Grace, his mother, noticed the change immediately. She tried to reason with him, reminding him of his responsibilities and of the baby, Bennett, who still needed him to be stable. But Stephen's world had narrowed to one thought: getting his son back and somehow fixing what he'd lost. He convinced himself that if he could just see Katie again, she would change her mind. On the evening of April 11th, Stephen arrived at his mother's home in Cary, North Carolina, asking to take Bennett for the night. He told Grace he planned to drive the baby to New York the next morning, to see Katie, to make things right. Grace hesitated but eventually agreed. Before he left, she noticed something in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but emptiness. She would later recall that moment in a trembling statement to police. He said he'd take the baby to her, then come home. But he never did. That night passed quietly. Grace waited for a message that never came. She called his phone several times, each one going unanswered. At first, she tried to believe the best, that he'd made the long drive safely, that he was with Katie, that maybe they were talking things through. But as the hours stretched past midnight, worry began to harden into dread. By dawn, she knew something was wrong. She picked up the phone and tried one last time to reach her son. When he finally called back, he said just enough to destroy her world. And within moments of hanging up, Grace was dialing 911, her hands shaking so hard she could barely press the buttons. "My son just called me," she told the dispatcher. "He said he killed his baby, and he's on his way to New York."
To the emergency. Yes. My son just called me, and he told me oh my God, in North Carolina, he killed his baby, and he's in the house. Okay, you said that he told you he killed his baby? Okay, ma'am, listen to me. What's your name? Okay, tell me exactly what happened. He's not home. His wife broke up with him over the phone yesterday.
It's crazy how Grace addressed Katie as his wife.
He told me she's in New York, and he told me he was on his way. He called me last night and said he's on his way. He's going to bring the baby to her, and then he was coming back. And he just okay. He said he killed his wife, he killed her father, and I can't even believe this is happening. And did this happen in Knightdale? No. His wife and father are in New York. Okay, and, so the incident actually... he left the baby dead when he left.
She didn't mention that based on the law, Steve shouldn't be anywhere near Katie, and she didn't see anything wrong with it when Steve mentioned that he wanted to go see Katie.
And he said he left last night. He called me, I forget, maybe about 7 last night, and said he was on his way to New York. He was going to bring to his wife. and given to her, and then he'd be back. And he called me this morning. I just got off the phone just a couple of minutes ago, and he told me to call the police, that I shouldn't go over there.
Okay, so the son is so your son is not there?
No, the house is empty. He said he put a key under the front mat. A key to get into the house under the front mat.
Did he say how he did it, or what
no,
he did?
And I didn't ask him. I didn't want to know. Oh my God, he's such a wonderful little.
Okay, hold on just a second, okay?
When police arrived at Stephen's house in Nightdale, they forced their way inside and found 7-month-old Bennett lying unresponsive. The cause of death was later believed to be suffocation, though Stephen never left a note, and no one could explain the final moments that led to it. Meanwhile, more than 500 miles away, another tragedy was already unfolding. In New Milford, Connecticut, around 8:30 a.m., Katie and her adoptive father, Tony Fusco, were driving along Route 55 and Route 7, heading to visit her grandmother. It was a routine trip, one they made twice a week. They didn't know that just a few hundred yards behind them, Stephen was following in a rented minivan. He had driven through the night, consumed by obsession and grief. When the light turned red at the intersection, he pulled up beside their car and rolled down the window. What happened next lasted seconds, but it ended 2 lives instantly. Bystanders later told police they heard a burst of noise followed by screams and the sound of shattering glass. Cars screeched to a stop as people ran for cover.
911, what's the location of your emergency?
Hello, this is Connecticut. It's on Route 7 and Route 55. Someone just went by and shot a guy in a truck.
Somebody just shot somebody in a truck on Route 55, sir?
Yes, right at the beginning of Route 55 and Route 7. It just happened. I'm a fireman out of New York. The car pulled up, went around him, shot him. Whole clip full into his head.
Okay, sir. Are you still with him?
We're here at the road.
Where? Right at the intersection?
Yes, sir. Right at the intersection.
Okay, sir.
He's deceased, boss. The truck's in the middle of the road.
He's dead?
Yes, sir. The brains are on the road.
And he was shot. Did you see the person who shot him?
Yeah, we pulled up. There's a whole, yes.
Who? Okay, which way did the vehicle go?
Headed toward New Milford, down Route 7.
Down Route 7? Can you describe the vehicle to me?
It's a blue minivan with, I believe, a South Carolina plate.
Blue minivan, South Carolina plate?
Yes, sir. A light blue minivan.
The man who called was a New York firefighter who was passing by. He mentioned that vehicle has a South Carolina license plate, but later corrected himself and said it was a North Carolina license plate.
2 ONG trucks. These 2 were behind them. As soon as he opened fire and shot these 2 people, he went up there around them.
Are there 2 people deceased, sir?
Yes, sir.
There's 2 people deceased.
That's what's in the car is all.
2 people. 2 people who were shot.
Yes, sir. I'm going to pull my truck up here and block the view of everything, and then we'll try to keep them going around. Okay? Well, I'm going to try.
Okay, sir. Sir, are you positive that they're deceased?
I'd say they're both deceased, don't you? Yeah. I mean, it's pretty bad. Their brains are laying here.
Were they both shot in the head, sir? Sir?
I'm looking.
Okay. Oh, I mean, don't touch anything, sir. I'm just trying to clarify.
I know they're both deceased. Yeah, the other one shot in there.
Did you see the shooting happen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And did you see a rifle, a shotgun, or a handgun?
Couldn't tell you nothing.
You
I
couldn't
just
tell me
see
nothing?
the vehicle alongside of it, and the shots coming outside the window going through.
Paramedics rushed to the scene, but it was too late. Katie, just 20 years old, and Tony, 56, were both gone before the ambulance arrived. About 30 minutes later, New York State Police located his van parked along a rural road in Dover, not far from where Katie had grown up. Inside, they found Stephen dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The man who had once claimed to love his daughter had now destroyed his entire family. And with him, he took the truth of what he'd told himself to justify it all. In the span of one morning, 3 generations were gone: a child, a daughter, a father. In the days that followed, 2 states shared a single tragedy. Police from North Carolina and Connecticut held joint press conferences, piecing together the timeline, confirming that the same man had taken 3 lives within hours. In her first interview after the murders, Alyssa Plattel spoke through tears. She described a man she had once loved but had long feared, someone she had warned others about for years. He was dangerous. He was isolated. I lost my daughter 3 times, at birth, to him, and forever. Katie was buried beside her adoptive father, Tony Fusco, in Dover, New York, the same town where she had once dreamed of becoming an artist, the same place she had believed she was safe. And now we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have changed the outcome of this case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them because every perspective matters. If this story moved you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.
For the last time, Joseph Fritzl took the long walk to court. A dozen policemen guarding a man who's received thousands of death threats. He looked every inch someone ready to finally face judgment. This is the face of a man who's been broken. After the cameras had left, his lawyer told the jury it was the presence of his daughter Elizabeth in court this week that made him change his pleas. Fritzl himself then addressed the jury. "I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart," he said. "Unfortunately, I can't change anything now."
It began quietly, the way most life and death moments do. Inside Amstetten General Hospital, a young woman lay on a gurney, unresponsive. Her skin looked almost translucent, the kind of pale that suggested she hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time. Faint blue veins traced her arms, and an oral exam showed severe dental deterioration. She appeared extremely frail, her age hard to place. Standing beside her was an elderly man, gray-haired and trembling slightly, his clothes neat, his expression unreadable. He told the staff her name was Kirsten. He said she was his granddaughter. A nurse leaned in to whisper, almost under her breath, "She's 19, but she looks 50. The doctors searched for her medical file, but there was nothing, no school records, no vaccination history, and no trace that this young woman had ever existed. When they asked the old man for the mother's contact information, he paused too long. His eyes darted between the doctors. His story shifted. Once, then again. First he said the mother was traveling, then he said she'd joined a religious group somewhere far away. The staff exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't know who this man really was, or where the girl had come from, but something about the way he stood there, quiet, rehearsed, almost waiting, set off every alarm in the room. What they didn't realize was that they weren't treating an ordinary patient. And the man standing beside her wasn't just a grandfather. He was the keeper of one of the darkest secrets Austria had ever known. In April 2008, that single hospital visit would uncover a hidden world, an underground prison, a family trapped in silence, and a truth that had been buried beneath the same house for 24 years. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Joseph Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935 in the small Austrian town of Amstetten, a place that would one day become synonymous with horror. His parents, Maria Fritzl, née Nenning, and Josef Fritzl Sr., were not a loving couple. His father was a violent alcoholic who often vanished for days, and when he did return, it was usually in a rage. He would shout, drink, and strike Maria without hesitation, and by the time little Joseph was 4 years old, his father had abandoned them completely. Maria raised her son alone, but her parenting carried the scars of a harsh, war-torn Europe. She was rigid, cold, and unforgiving. When Joseph misbehaved, which for a boy his age could mean almost anything, she would tie him to his bed or send him outside barefoot, forcing him to sleep in the yard as punishment. She hit him with her fists, her boots, or whatever she could find nearby, and the neighbors learned not to interfere. They would later describe Maria as a woman made of stone. Then came the war. Amstetten, unfortunately positioned between Germany and Italy, became a regular target for Allied bombers. Nights were filled with the low rumble of aircraft and the fear of not waking up. Food was scarce, and life revolved around surviving each day. Joseph grew up surrounded by rubble and silence, and even at a young age, he learned that control was power. That if he could not control his surroundings, he could at least control himself. After the war, Soviet forces occupied Amstetten, and the town became a dangerous place for women and children. Violence and assaults were common, and Joseph watched his mother grow even harder, even more punishing. She told him often that men were weak, that love made people foolish, and that he would need to be strong to survive. So he obeyed her. He learned to fix things around the house, spending hours taking apart radios and appliances and putting them back together. People began calling him the boy who could repair anything, and in that mechanical precision he found something that made sense: order, predictability, control. But beneath that discipline, something darker was forming. By 16, Joseph had begun lurking near parks and alleyways, watching women from a distance. One evening, unable to contain whatever was stirring inside him, he leapt from the bushes and exposed himself to a passing woman. She screamed and he ran. No charges were filed, but it was the first recorded sign of a pattern that would never end. After high school, Joseph moved to the nearby city of Linz, taking night classes in electrical and mechanical engineering. He worked days in a metal fabrication plant and spent his evenings studying, driven by a need to appear respectable, to rise above his upbringing. Those who met him described him as polite and serious, not warm, not friendly, just efficient. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. By 1956, at 21, Joseph attended a social gathering where he met Rosemarie Bayer, a quiet 17-year-old with soft features and modest ambitions. She came from a conservative family, devoted to routine and religion, qualities that appealed to Joseph. She was gentle, unassuming, and eager to please. Their courtship was brief, but for Joseph, it was enough. She wanted a husband who would provide stability, and he wanted someone who would never challenge his authority. They married that same year. People who knew them later would say their marriage looked ordinary from the outside, the picture of mid-century Austrian domestic life. But behind closed doors, Joseph's obsession with control was growing. He liked schedules, he liked silence, and he liked to be obeyed. He liked rules, he liked control, he liked silence. And in the quiet halls of their Amstetten home, those three things would soon define everything he became. After their wedding, Joseph and Rosemarie settled into what seemed like a modest but stable life. They moved into his mother's old boarding house in Amstetten, a large gray building that smelled faintly of metal and damp concrete. Maria, his mother, still lived upstairs, renting rooms to travelers and factory workers. Joseph and Rosemarie took a small two-bedroom flat on the lower floor, and though it was cramped, the rent was cheap, and Joseph liked the familiarity of his childhood walls. During the week, he worked in Linz, about an hour's drive away, spending long hours at a construction materials company. He came home only on weekends, always unannounced, always expecting things to be just as he left them. Rosemarie stayed behind in Amstetten, taking care of their growing family and his demanding mother. To outsiders, they looked like a hard-working, traditional couple, the strict but responsible engineer and his quiet, dutiful wife. But inside those walls there was no warmth, only obedience, fear, and control. Their first child, Ulrika, was born in 1957. 2 years later came Rosemarie Jr., and then in 1963, their first son, Harold. Each new baby brought Rosemarie joy, but it also brought more work and more isolation. Joseph rarely helped with the children, claiming he was too busy with his projects. He liked to remind her that everything they had, the roof, the money, the food, came from him, and that she owed him respect. In 1966, their fourth child, Elizabeth, was born. She was small and quiet, with pale blue eyes like her mother's. Joseph appeared indifferent to her as a baby, but he paid attention in ways that made people uneasy. Silent, lingering looks, questions about where she slept, what she wore. Still, Rosemarie said nothing. In that house, no one questioned Joseph. He was respected in the community and liked to project an image of precision and discipline. He walked to work in pressed shirts, carried his tools neatly packed in a leather bag, and spent his evenings tinkering with wiring and blueprints. But by 1967, the cracks in that image began to show. In October of that year, he had been watching a young nurse in Linz, following her for weeks, learning her schedule. When he discovered that her husband worked night shifts, Joseph began to plan. One evening, he waited outside her apartment until the lights dimmed, then climbed through an open window. Inside, he found a knife in her kitchen, crept into her bedroom, and attacked her. The assault was violent, calculated, and carried out in silence. When it was over, he left through the same window, walking home as if nothing had happened. But the woman called the police immediately. Joseph was arrested within days, and under questioning, he confessed. There was no remorse, no emotion, just an admission of fact. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, but served only 12. And what was perhaps most disturbing was that his wife never questioned him. Rosemary visited him regularly behind bars, bringing him food and clothes, telling friends that her husband had simply made a terrible mistake. The neighbors pitied her, calling her a good woman with a difficult husband. When Joseph was released, his conviction was quietly buried under bureaucracy. Austria's criminal record laws at the time automatically erased old convictions after 15 years, so by the early 1980s there would be no trace of his crime on paper. He was free to start again, with no oversight, no warning label, and no suspicion. He returned to Amstetten, resumed his engineering job, and rebuilt his reputation. People saw a man who had learned from his past, a man dedicated to his family and his work. He kept his head down, fixed things, and volunteered to help with building projects in the neighborhood. He even told his new employer about his criminal record during the interview, but they hired him anyway. His skill and precision outweighed any moral concern. From that point on, Joseph's life looked, from the outside, like a portrait of redemption. He built extensions on the family home, added a terrace, and talked about converting the basement into storage. But those who lived under his roof knew that nothing had truly changed. His temper still simmered just beneath the surface. He shouted often, and his punishments were unpredictable. The walls that once protected his family were now beginning to close in on them. And while the town saw a respectable man behind closed doors, his control deepened. It wasn't enough for Joseph to have order. He wanted ownership of his house, his family, and eventually of another human life. As said earlier, Elisabeth Fritzl was born on April 8, 1966, the fourth child in a family that already lived under the quiet shadow of fear. From her earliest years, she was soft-spoken and careful, the kind of child who learned quickly that silence kept her safe. Her teachers described her as bright and observant, but distant, always glancing toward the clock, always eager to go home, as though she had somewhere else she needed to be, even when she didn't. Her father, Joseph Fritzl, treated her differently from the others. At first, it was subtle. Longer looks, an unusual closeness, moments of attention that felt more like inspection than affection. But when Elizabeth entered adolescence, that attention turned invasive. Around the age of 11, Joseph began crossing lines that no father ever should. It started with what he called teaching moments, a touch on the shoulder that lingered too long, a pat on the leg that made her freeze. She never spoke about it. No one in that house spoke about anything that might upset Joseph. His temper was the boundary they all lived within. Rosemary, her mother, stayed busy with chores, pretending not to notice the shifts in his behavior. The older siblings kept their distance too, each of them conditioned by years of shouting and sudden punishment. By her teenage years, she began dreaming of escape. She wanted to see something beyond the small town of Amstetten, a world that wasn't ruled by fear. So, in January 1983, at 17, she made her first attempt. She ran away from home with a coworker she trusted from the restaurant where she had been training to be a waitress. They made it all the way to Vienna and found temporary work in a local bar. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth felt free. She laughed easily. She spoke to people without glancing over her shoulder, and she started to believe she might never have to see her father again. But that freedom lasted only 3 weeks. When the police found her during a routine ID check, they called her parents. Joseph drove to Vienna himself to pick her up, pretending to be a worried father grateful that his daughter was safe. The officers handed her over, unaware of what she was really running from. When she got home, the door closed, and that brief taste of freedom disappeared. The police wrote her off as a rebellious teenager, another restless girl who had run away to the city. Joseph made sure everyone saw it that way. He told neighbors and relatives that she was disobedient, ungrateful, and out of control. Inside the house, he punished her for embarrassing him. Years later, during interrogation, Elizabeth would recall what she had felt in those final days before he took her for good. "I thought maybe if I ran away, he'd forget about me," she said quietly. But he didn't. He never forgot anything. That attempt at escape convinced Joseph that he needed to act. He believed his daughter was slipping out of his grasp, and to a man who thrived on control, that was intolerable. By the late 1970s, Joseph Fritzl had started preparing for something no one around him could have imagined, a project that would exist outside the law, outside morality, and eventually outside daylight itself. In 1978, Joseph approached Amstetten's city authorities with an idea that, at the time, sounded entirely reasonable. He said he wanted to build a nuclear fallout shelter beneath his house at 40 Ibstrasse, a reinforced cellar that could protect his family in case of a Cold War emergency. And in the late 1970s, that idea didn't raise suspicion. The world was tense, and the threat of nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was real, and Austrian law even encouraged homeowners to build private shelters. Joseph submitted plans that looked legitimate: thick concrete walls, reinforced doors, an emergency generator, and a ventilation system. The city issued him the permits, unaware that what he was building went far beyond any safety design. Once he had official approval, Joseph began digging. He worked alone, and he preferred it that way. He spent 6 years modifying the cellar, slowly transforming it into something that only he could understand. At first, it was a simple basement, then a workshop, then a labyrinth. He extended the walls, poured layers of concrete by hand, and installed pipes and wiring with surgical precision. He built 8 separate doors, each one more secure than the last, creating a path that led deeper underground with every turn. Behind one of those doors, he left a narrow passage barely a meter high, concealed behind a sliding bookcase. Crawling through it led into a hidden chamber, a room so deep and so isolated that no one outside could hear even a scream. Joseph added soundproof panels, a small sink, a stove, and eventually a bed. He installed vents that connected to the main house, but disguised them behind fake walls. He did almost all of this at night. When his wife and children were asleep, he would slip into the cellar, carrying tools in cloth bags so they wouldn't clatter. He mixed concrete by hand, muffling the sound with old rags, and told anyone who asked that he was experimenting with new machinery for work. The truth was far darker. Joseph was designing a prison. Every bolt, every pipe, every door had a purpose. He reinforced the ceilings with steel, sealed the walls against sound, and even built an emergency power switch that only he could operate. He created his own ventilation and water system, ensuring that no one, not even the people living upstairs, would hear or smell a trace of what was happening below. The cellar wasn't just a room, it was a trap engineered by someone who wanted total control over another human being. To the city, it was a fallout shelter. To Joseph, it was a world entirely of his own making, a place where no one could question him, contradict him, or escape him. And by the time the final door was fitted, his plan was complete. He had built a home above ground for his family and a prison below for his daughter. By the summer of 1984, Elizabeth Fritzl was 18 years old and ready to start a new chapter of her life. She had finally secured a job offer in Linz, a city nearly an hour from Amstetten, and she was counting down the days to her move. To her, it felt like freedom, a quiet, ordinary kind of freedom, but one she had been waiting for all her life. She was packing her things when her father approached her with what sounded like a simple request. Joseph told her he needed help fitting a door in the basement, one final task before she left for her new job. It wasn't unusual. He often worked on small home projects, and Elizabeth had helped him before. That afternoon, on August 28, 1984, she followed him down the narrow steps into the cellar, unaware that she was stepping into a place she would not leave for 24 years. The air downstairs was cool and thick with dust. Joseph directed her to hold the heavy metal door in place while he adjusted its hinges. She steadied it, waiting for his signal. But as she stood there, she suddenly heard the door swing shut, a hollow clang that echoed through the small space. Then came the sting of something wet pressed against her mouth and nose. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was her father's hand holding an ether-soaked cloth against her face. When Elizabeth woke up, she was lying on a thin mattress in a cramped, windowless room. Her head throbbed, her wrists ached, and when she tried to move, she realized she couldn't. A metal chain was locked around her waist, fastened to a post fixed into the concrete floor. The room was dimly lit by a small bulb. There were no windows, no clocks, no sense of time. Just the low ceiling, the smell of damp concrete, and the slow panic building in her chest. She screamed for hours. She shouted for her mother, for anyone who might be close enough to hear. But above her, the world continued as normal. Her family ate dinner, neighbors went about their routines, and not a single sound escaped the layers of concrete Joseph had built around her. When he returned that night, she begged him to let her go. But Joseph simply stood there, calm and collected, as if this was all inevitable. He told her that the doors were wired to release toxic gas if she ever tried to open them from the inside. Then he handed her a sheet of paper and told her to write a letter. In shaky handwriting, Elizabeth wrote the words he dictated, "I've joined a cult. Please don't look for me." When she finished, Joseph took the letter, left the cellar, and drove nearly 100 miles away before mailing it to himself. A few days later, he brought it home and gave it to Rosemarie, pretending to be as shocked as she was. He showed it to the police, who accepted it as proof that Elizabeth had left willingly. The case was officially closed. Down below, Elizabeth realized what that meant. No one was looking for her. No one even knew she was missing. Joseph began visiting the cellar every night. He brought food, bread, milk, canned soup, and supplies, but never comfort. He kept the lights on at his discretion, and when he spoke, it was to remind her who was in control. The fear was constant, and the silence between his visits was worse. Time began to dissolve. Days turned into nights, and nights into something endless. He told her this was temporary, that he would release her when she learned to behave. But Elizabeth had grown up in his house. She knew what his promises were worth. Each time she heard the sound of the locks above, she knew what was coming next. The cellar was no longer a project or an idea. It was now a reality, a private world that existed entirely beneath the surface, one that Joseph ruled completely. And for Elizabeth, it had become the only world she knew. By 1988, 4 years into her captivity, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child. She named her Kirsten. There was no hospital, no doctor, and no help, only a thin mattress, a pair of blunt scissors, and a damp towel. Joseph had provided her with an old 1960s childbirth manual and a bottle of disinfectant, as if that made the process civilized. The pain was unbearable, but Kirsten's first cry pierced through the basement like a reminder that life could still exist in this darkness. 2 years later, she had Stefan, and by 1992, another child, Lisa. But that time, Joseph decided to change things. When Lisa was just a few months old, he carried her upstairs, wrapped in a blanket. A few hours later, the family found her on the doorstep in a cardboard box, along with a letter from Elizabeth. The note, dictated and forced, said she couldn't care for her child and was leaving her in her parents' care. Joseph played the role of the bewildered father again, calling the police, expressing concern, and handing over the letter as proof. And it worked. Rosemarie and the authorities accepted the story, and Joseph and Rosemarie were granted guardianship of Lisa without question. And soon, the same pattern followed. In 1994, another child, Monica, appeared on the doorstep. Again, there was a note. Again, no one doubted it. Each time, Joseph staged the discovery carefully, at night, in winter, always with the same confused expression when social workers arrived. When social services asked how Elizabeth knew their new phone number, Rosemarie could only shrug and say, "She must be in a commune somewhere. We pray she's safe." It sounded plausible enough. Austria had seen stories of young people disappearing into spiritual groups or remote sects before, and since Joseph was calm, polite, and always cooperative, no one pressed further. But below, the truth was unbearable. Elizabeth now had 3 children with her in the cellar, Kirsten, Stefan, and later Felix, who would be born much later in 2003. The room was stifling, with barely 600 square feet of space for 4 lives. He brought food, water, and sometimes small comforts, a few books, crayons, or a small television. He told her, "You can teach them. Keep them quiet." So she did. Elizabeth turned that underground prison into a classroom. She taught her children to read, to count, to sing softly. She played them stories on the radio, told them about the sun, and promised them that one day they would see it. But as the years went on, even she began to lose faith in that promise. Then came 1996, when she gave birth to twins, Alexander and Michael. The birth was the most difficult yet. The room was cold, and the babies were premature, and within hours, Michael began to struggle to breathe. Elizabeth panicked. She begged Joseph to take him to a hospital, pleading that the baby wouldn't survive without help. Joseph looked at her, emotionless, and said only, "What will be, will be." He never took the baby upstairs. For 3 days, Elizabeth held Michael in her arms, watching him fade, praying for a miracle that never came, and when the infant finally stopped breathing, Joseph took the body away. The next time he came down, the air in the cellar smelled faintly of burned wood and chemicals. Later, investigators would confirm that he had cremated the remains in the house furnace. That moment changed everything. Elizabeth's hope, fragile and flickering, went out completely. She realized that she was not being punished temporarily. She was being erased, piece by piece, from the world above. And so she stopped asking for help. She stopped counting the years and stopped believing that anyone would ever find her alive. Joseph's world was divided. A quiet, normal household upstairs, filled with laughter from the children everyone thought were adopted, and a silent world below, where their mother and siblings lived in darkness, completely forgotten. He had built not just a prison, but an illusion, and for nearly 2 decades it worked. While the world above continued in silence, the world below was changing shape. By the late 1990s, the underground prison had expanded from its original 380 square feet to nearly 590 square feet. 2 small sleeping areas, a narrow corridor, a basic cooking space, and a toilet. Joseph forced Elizabeth and her children to dig the walls by hand, passing buckets of dirt and rubble through the narrow passage he alone could unlock. The ceilings remained low, barely 6 feet high, so that even the growing children had to stoop when they walked. After 24 years underground, everything began to unravel because of one desperate decision and one dying girl. On April 19, 2008, Kirsten, Elizabeth's eldest daughter, suddenly collapsed. At 19, she was fragile and pale, her body weak from years without sunlight. Her skin had lost all trace of color, and her bones had grown brittle from severe vitamin D deficiency. That night, she began having seizures, her breathing shallow, her body trembling uncontrollably. Elizabeth tried everything she could, cold cloths, water, prayers, but nothing helped. She fell to her knees and begged her father to save her child. For hours, Joseph refused. He had ignored similar pleas before, but this time Kirsten's condition was different. Her body was shutting down, and even he knew she wouldn't survive another day. Finally, and perhaps out of fear of losing control rather than compassion, Joseph agreed. He opened the final door. Together, he and Elizabeth carried Kirsten up the narrow passageway. As Elizabeth stepped out, she saw daylight for the first time in 24 years. The brightness stung her eyes, and the air felt strange, sharp, and almost unreal. But there was no time to stop. They placed Kirsten in the car, and Joseph locked Elizabeth back inside the cellar. At the Amstetten General Hospital, doctors immediately recognized that something was deeply wrong. Kirsten's skin was almost translucent, her veins visible through the surface. She was severely underweight, and her teeth were decayed beyond repair. The medical team searched for her file, but nothing came up. No birth record, no medical history, no school enrollment. When they asked Joseph for basic information, the girl's mother, her background, her allergies, his answers didn't make sense. He hesitated, changed details, and grew defensive. At one point, he told them his daughter, Elizabeth, had joined a religious cult years ago and had left the child on his doorstep. The doctors exchanged glances. Something didn't fit. Joseph's composure was rehearsed, but not consistent. And when they tried to contact the mother he described, no one could find her. They contacted the police. Soon, a public appeal aired on Austrian television. "Elizabeth, if you are out there, please come forward. Your daughter is gravely ill. We need your help." For the first time in 2 decades, Joseph realized his control was slipping. The police were reopening a case he thought he had buried long ago. The next few days, he appeared anxious, pacing, muttering, and staying close to the basement. On April 26th, 1 week after Kirsten's hospital admission, Joseph made his final move. He went down to the cellar and told Elizabeth to pack what she could. He said they were going to the hospital to help Kirsten, but his voice carried a warning edge. He brought Elizabeth and her 2 remaining underground children, Stefan and Felix, upstairs. Before they left, he looked at her and said, stick to the story, or you'll never see them again. It was the first time Elizabeth had been outside long enough to take in her surroundings, the same streets she had walked as a teenager, the same sky she used to dream beneath. But the moment wasn't freedom, it was fear. When they arrived at the hospital, police were already waiting. Doctors had alerted authorities that Joseph's explanations didn't add up, and now the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Officers then separated Joseph and Elizabeth for questioning. At first, she sat silently. Her hands shook, and she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Investigators thought she was in shock, perhaps even complicit in the neglect. But then she made a single request. "I'll tell you everything, if I never have to see him again." Once the officers agreed, she began to speak. For the next several hours, Elizabeth recounted everything. How he had lured her into the cellar, how he'd kept her there for 24 years, how she had raised 7 children in captivity, and how one of them had died in her arms. Her story was measured, detailed, and consistent. Too consistent to be anything but true. That same night, police arrested Josef Fritzl, then 73 years old. They took him from the hospital in handcuffs as news cameras began to gather outside. When investigators entered the Fritzl home, they followed the narrow path he had described, through corridors, behind bookshelves, past heavy steel doors, until they reached what one officer later called a house beneath a house. Inside that underground world, they found the remnants of lives that had been lived entirely in the shadows. Children's drawings pinned to damp walls, tiny clothes folded neatly beside an old crib, and a calendar frozen in time. After 24 years, the secret that Amstetten never saw had finally come to light. The truth that emerged after Josef Fritzl's arrest was almost beyond belief, yet every scientific test confirmed it. Within days, DNA analysis proved what Elizabeth had already said in her statement, that Joseph was the father of all 6 surviving children, including those raised upstairs by his wife, Rosemarie. There were no other possible fathers. The evidence was absolute. When confronted with the results, Joseph barely reacted. During his interrogation, he spoke calmly, even confidently, as if trying to explain a business decision rather than a crime. He told investigators, "I created a second life underground. They were happy there." He insisted that what happened between him and Elizabeth had been consensual, describing it as a private arrangement, a twisted rationalization that left detectives speechless. When asked about the infant, Michael, who was gone shortly after birth, Joseph denied any wrongdoing. He claimed the child had been stillborn and that there was nothing he could have done. But the medical reports showed otherwise. The baby had suffered from a treatable respiratory condition, one that would have been survivable with even basic medical attention. As prosecutors gathered evidence, Elizabeth and her children were moved to a secure psychiatric hospital for rehabilitation. For months, doctors shielded them from the media, helping them adjust to sunlight and open spaces again. Elizabeth agreed to testify only through videotaped recordings, unable to face her father in person. The trial began in March 2009 at the Regional Court of St. Pölten, Austria. Journalists from around the world filled the seats, and security around the courthouse was intense. The proceedings were harrowing from the very start. Elizabeth's taped testimony ran for nearly 11 hours, played in 2-hour segments to the jury because the content was too disturbing to endure all at once. In the footage, she spoke quietly but clearly, recounting every year of her captivity, the fear, the manipulation, and the children she raised beneath the floor of their family home. Jurors were seen wiping away tears. Even seasoned court staff struggled to remain composed. Joseph, sitting only a few meters away, kept his head down as the recording played, occasionally shaking his head as though denying what everyone already knew. His defense attorney tried to humanize him, insisting Joseph was not a monster and pointing out that he had brought Christmas trees and toys to his family in the cellar. It was an argument that only deepened the public outrage. On March 19, 2009, 4 days into the trial, something in Joseph's composure finally broke. He looked toward the courtroom, saw Elizabeth sitting there, disguised but present, and immediately turned pale. The next morning he asked to address the judge. He withdrew all previous denials and changed his plea to guilty on all charges. The courtroom fell silent as he admitted, for the first time, that he had destroyed the lives of his own family. The court sentenced Josef Fritzl to life imprisonment in a facility for the criminally insane, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. When the verdict was read, Elizabeth did not look at him. She had already turned away, toward the future that had been stolen from her for 24 years, but one she was finally free to reclaim. After the trial, Elizabeth and her 6 surviving children were given new identities, their pasts erased, their lives starting anew. They were relocated to a secure village, far from the prying eyes of the world that had once so casually dismissed their suffering. The only life they had known, locked away beneath a house in Amstetten, was now a part of their history that could never truly be escaped, but would no longer define them. They began long-term therapy at the Amstetten Mauer Clinic, a place where they could begin the difficult process of healing. Each child, in their own way, had to learn how to live outside the confines of those 4 walls. For some, it was the challenge of feeling the warmth of sunlight after years in darkness. For others, it was learning to trust again after being raised in fear and isolation. Elizabeth's own journey was just as grueling, but she had one purpose above all: to give her children the future they deserved. Rosemarie, Joseph's wife and Elizabeth's mother, was unable to bear the weight of what had happened. She moved away, distancing herself from her daughter, unable to reconcile the woman she had married with the man who had hidden such horrors right beneath her roof. Years passed and the emotional wounds remained deep. However, Elizabeth, despite the unimaginable betrayal, found it in her heart to forgive her mother. The relationship, once fractured beyond repair, slowly began to mend, but it would never be the same. In 2013, the house that had held such dark secrets was sealed forever. The authorities filled it with concrete, burying the past within its walls, quite literally. Afterward, it was sold, a family's prison transformed into a place for new beginnings. As for Joseph Fritzl, now known by the name Josef Meyerhoff, he remained in psychiatric custody, unable to hide from the consequences of his actions. His years of manipulation had twisted his mind, but the law had ensured that he would never again have access to the world he had once controlled. In 2021, a higher court ruled that Joseph would remain confined indefinitely. No longer a man of influence, no longer a figure of authority in his own life, he would be isolated in a secure psychiatric facility for the rest of his days. His fate was sealed, but that of his victims remained in motion, their lives a testament to survival, resilience, and the power of hope. As Elizabeth's therapist once said, freedom was not the end of their story, it was the beginning of learning how to live again. For Elizabeth, her children, and for the world that watched in horror, their journey toward healing had only just begun. Now we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have been done to prevent something like this? Was there a point in this horrifying story where someone could have stepped in and stopped Joseph Fritzl before it was too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. We read every single one of them, and your perspective matters. And if this story moved you, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories just like this one. We bring you the facts, the stories, and the emotional depth you won't find anywhere else. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourself, stay safe, and remember, some stories need to be told. Cheers.
It is one of the most shocking and horrifying murder cases to ever happen in East Tennessee, one that took 2 young lives full of promise and put their families through 8 criminal trials. The tragic murders shocked the community and the families of these 2 young victims. 21-year-old Shannon Christian attended the University of Tennessee. Her boyfriend, Chris Newsom, was a 23-year-old former Halls High School baseball standout. Armed men carjacked and killed them just a few days into the new year of 2007. 2 young lives were lost and 2 families were forever changed. We do have a warning. The details of this case may not be suitable for some of you.
It was a freezing January morning in Knoxville, Tennessee, when a railroad worker made a discovery that would change the city forever. Lying beside the tracks was a body, burned beyond recognition, wrapped in a blanket like discarded rubbish. The shoes were missing, the wrists had been bound, a gag had been forced into the mouth. And despite the fire, it was clear this was no accident. The victim was a young man, Christopher Newsom, but investigators quickly realized he had not been alone. Only hours earlier, witnesses had seen him with his girlfriend, Shannon Christian. She had vanished, and no one knew if she was alive or if she too had fallen into the hands of whoever left this body by the tracks. But who was this young man? And where was the young woman last seen with him? What investigators uncovered in the next 48 hours would horrify Tennessee. But the discovery at the railroad tracks was only the beginning. What followed in the courts over the next 2 decades was so disturbing that even prosecutors fainted during testimony, and the families of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom were forced to sit through retrials, appeals, and parole hearings that dragged the nightmare out for years. This case would not fade into memory. It would come to be known as the Knoxville Horror. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Channon Gail Christian had been born in Nacogdoches, Texas on April 29, 1985. But by the time she was 12, her family had settled in Knoxville, Tennessee, where she grew up with her younger brother Chase. Her parents, Gary and Dina Christian, often said she had been the kind of child who filled a room with energy the moment she stepped inside, and teachers remembered a student whose smile could lift a class on even the most difficult day. She was smart, motivated, and by early 2007, she was only months away from completing her degree in sociology at the University of Tennessee. She worked 2 jobs to help pay her way, and the effort allowed her to buy the silver Toyota 4Runner she proudly drove to school and work. Her friends said she was both practical and ambitious, and she had already started talking about graduate school and a career that would let her help people who didn't have the same opportunities she did. But her life wasn't just about responsibilities and studies. Channon had an easy warmth that made people feel included. Her closest friend, Kara, described her as more like a sister than anything else, because Channon spent so much time at her apartment that it felt as though she lived there too. She loved golf, she loved being outdoors, and she often talked about wanting to raise a big family of her own one day with 4 children, because she wanted to recreate the same kind of bond she had always felt with her parents. Her mother, Dina, called her my joyful one, and her father, Gary, described her as the center of our world. However, Christopher Newsom had been born 2 years earlier, on September 21, 1983, and unlike Channon, he had lived in Knoxville all his life. He attended Halls High School, where he became known as both an athlete and a friend to almost everyone. He played baseball for the Halls Red Devils, and while he was never the biggest player on the field, his teammates remembered that he played with determination, and they noticed how often he made a point of encouraging others who might not have been as confident. Chris had a reputation for kindness. One classmate recalled that he once took a girl to prom simply because she didn't have anyone else to go with, and it was that kind of gesture that made him stand out. After high school, Chris briefly studied at Pellissippi State Community College, but he found his passion in carpentry. He enjoyed working with his hands, and his family remembered how proud he was when he finished projects that demanded both skill and creativity. He loved building things that lasted, his father Hugh once said, and that pride carried over into how Chris treated people. His mother, Mary, described him as the kind of young man who always came home when he said he would, who always answered the phone when she called, and who never left anyone wondering whether he cared. By late 2006, their paths had crossed. Channon and Chris met through mutual friends, and the connection between them grew quickly. They began dating in November, and although it had only been a couple of months by the start of 2007, their relationship was already serious. They had introduced each other to their families, and both sets of parents noticed how happy their children seemed together. Channon's friends teased her that she smiled differently when Chris was around, and Chris's best friend Josh remembered how Chris talked about her constantly. The people closest to them could see how natural the relationship felt. Channon's mother said, "She was glowing. She was just so happy with him," and Chris's father added, "He'd found someone who made him better. You could tell he wanted a future with her." They were young, but they had already begun to plan. Chris had talked about finding a home where he could build a workshop, and Channon spoke about how she wanted to balance her career with raising children. Friends said they were already discussing the shape of their future together. It was new, but it was real. So on the night of January 6th, 2007, when Chris drove to pick Channon up from Kara's apartment so they could head out for dinner and then join friends at a party, it was nothing unusual. They were just another young couple in love, planning an ordinary Saturday evening. But what began as a night of laughter and simple plans would never reach its end. January 6th, 2007 started like any ordinary Saturday for Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, but it would end as the night that changed Knoxville forever. That afternoon, Channon had gone to her best friend Kara's apartment on Washington Pike. She was excited about her evening plans and spent time there getting ready, carefully choosing her outfit and chatting with Kara about the night ahead. She was upbeat, relaxed, and looking forward to dinner, a party with friends, and just being with Chris. Meanwhile, across town, Chris spent the day with his closest friend, Josh. The two young men had been inseparable since high school, and Josh later remembered that Chris was in good spirits, looking forward to seeing Channon that night. The couple exchanged texts throughout the evening, coordinating their plans. Nothing about their messages suggested worry. They were doing what young couples everywhere did on a Saturday night, making plans to eat, laugh, and spend time together. Around 9 p.m., Chris drove his pickup truck to Kara's apartment complex to collect Channon. Security cameras outside captured their meeting. Channon walked out of the building, spotted Chris, and the two embraced. They stood for a moment smiling, before deciding to leave her car behind and take her Toyota 4Runner instead. It was a simple, ordinary scene, and nothing about it seemed unusual. But while they hugged, they were being watched. Lamarcus Davidson, his half-brother Latalvis Cobbins, and their associate Eric Boyd were circling the parking lot. They had been driving around the city that night looking for a vehicle to steal and people to target. When they saw Channon's SUV and the young couple together, they made their decision. Within minutes, their ordinary night turned into a nightmare. Guns were drawn. Chris and Channon were forced into the 4Runner at gunpoint, their hands tied and their freedom stolen in seconds. The abductors climbed into the vehicle, leaving Chris's pickup truck abandoned in the lot, the first silent clue that something terrible had just happened. And so, in less than 5 minutes, a bright young woman and a hard-working young man went from planning dinner and a party to being captives in their own car. They didn't know where they were being taken, and no one around them had any idea of the horror that was beginning to unfold. The drive from Kara's apartment complex to 2316 Chipman Street was less than 3 miles, but for Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, it was the longest journey of their lives. Davidson was behind the wheel, Cobbins rode beside him, and Boyd controlled the two terrified captives in the back seat. Neither Chris nor Channon had any idea where they were being taken, and the short ride must have felt endless. The destination was a small rental home in North Knoxville. It belonged to Lamarcus Davidson, who had been released from prison only months earlier. From the outside, the house looked like any other in the neighborhood, but inside it had become a base of drugs, crime, and violence. Waiting there were George Thomas and Vanessa Coleman, Cobbin's teenage girlfriend, who had joined the group for the weekend. When the 4Runner pulled up, the house was quiet, but that silence broke as Chris and Channon were dragged inside. Almost immediately, they were separated. Chris was forced into one part of the house, his wrists bound with shoelaces and his mouth gagged. He was restrained in ways designed to keep him powerless. Evidence later showed he was assaulted during those first hours, and the level of cruelty was more than investigators could bear to describe in open court without pausing. Channon, meanwhile, was taken into a bedroom where Coleman was left to guard her while the men came and went. Testimony later revealed that Coleman claimed to be frightened and powerless, but investigators and prosecutors insisted she was not simply a bystander. In her journal, written around that time, she described being on an adventure, words that prosecutors would later point to as evidence of her complicity. The house that night was not sealed off from the outside world. Davidson's girlfriend, Daphne Sutton, stopped by briefly. She had been in a volatile relationship with him and visited often, sometimes to see him, sometimes to pick up belongings. That night, she noticed nothing unusual, and she left without realizing that Channon was being held captive just a few rooms away. Later, when Davidson gave her clothing and other items, she assumed they were gifts. Only later did she learn that the clothes belonged to Channon, but the most haunting moment of that night came just after midnight. Around 12:30 a.m., Channon was allowed, or perhaps forced, to make a phone call to her parents. Gary and Dina Christian answered, relieved to hear their daughter's voice. She told them she would be home between 2 and 3 a.m., her voice steady, giving no sign of the danger she was in. Her parents believed her, because Channon always kept her word. They had no way of knowing it was a deception, meant to buy the captors more time before anyone would realize she was missing. It was the last time Gary and Dina Christian ever heard their daughter speak. By Sunday morning, January 7th, the first signs of panic had already set in. Gary and Dina Christian were waiting for their daughter, but Channon had not come home as promised. She always called, always kept her word, and her silence that morning was completely out of character. Across town, Hugh and Mary Newsom noticed the same absence. Their son Chris had not returned home either, and his phone had gone straight to voicemail all night. Both families knew something was wrong, but neither yet understood how bad it was. Chris's friends were equally unsettled. They had expected him at a party the night before, and when he never showed up, they assumed he might be running late. But by late that morning, unanswered calls and ignored messages could no longer be dismissed, so they drove back to the Washington Ridge apartments where Chris had picked Channon up the night before. His truck was still there, parked exactly where he had left it, but Channon's Toyota 4Runner was gone. So were both of them. The families reported them missing, but the police response was not what they expected. Officers explained that young adults sometimes took off for a day or two, and they could not officially treat it as a disappearance until 24 hours had passed. To Gary Christian and Hugh Newsom, the suggestion that their children had simply gone off on their own felt absurd. They knew their kids. This wasn't like them. So, when the police hesitated, the families acted. They began organizing their own search almost immediately. Flyers were printed and handed out. Friends drove to local hospitals, asking if either Chris or Channon had been admitted. They reached out to anyone who might have seen or heard from the couple, piecing together the final hours of Saturday night. The Christians even contacted Channon's cell phone provider themselves, refusing to wait for police approval. That call revealed the first real break. The last signal from Channon's phone had come from a tower on Cherry Street in North Knoxville. It was only a small clue, but for the families, it meant direction. They now knew where to look, and by that evening, search parties of relatives and friends were walking the streets near Cherry Street, hoping for any sign of the missing couple. What they found next would bring the case into sharp focus and place investigators just blocks away from the truth. However, just before this, something terrible had already taken place. In the early hours of January 7th, Christopher Newsom's ordeal came to its final moments. He had already endured hours of restraint and abuse inside the Chipman Street house, and then, sometime before dawn, he was forced outside. It was bitterly cold that night in Knoxville, and Chris was barefoot, wearing only minimal clothing, with his wrists and ankles still bound. His captors marched him away from the house, down toward the nearby railroad tracks, no more than a few hundred yards from where he had first been taken. His mouth had been gagged, his head covered with a sweatshirt pulled tight, and shoelaces had been used to hold everything in place. Each step left him more exposed to the winter air, but the walk was not about distance. It was about humiliation, control, and finality. Witnesses at trial would later explain that the group wanted Chris gone first, because his presence made it harder to contain Channon. When they reached the tracks, Chris was forced to the ground. He was shot 3 times, once in the neck, once in the back, and once in the head. The final shot, pressed close, ended his life instantly, and yet, even in death, they were not finished. His body was wrapped in a blanket, doused in fuel, and set on fire. The flames destroyed potential evidence, but they also left him unrecognizable to anyone who might stumble upon him. Later that same morning, as daylight spread over Knoxville, a railroad employee named William Powell was making his usual rounds along the tracks. He noticed something unusual lying near the rails, a shape wrapped in fabric, partly charred. As he drew closer, the reality became undeniable. It was a human body, burned, bound, and discarded beside the line. He called authorities immediately, and with that call, the investigation began. News of the discovery traveled fast, and it reached the Newsom family before the details were even fully confirmed. Hugh and Mary Newsom had been searching for their son all morning, making calls, asking friends, hoping for answers. Instead, they were met with the unthinkable. When Mary was told that her son had been found murdered, she collapsed, unable to process the weight of the words. But even in her devastation, she demanded to see him, no matter his condition. At the medical examiner's office, she stood over what remained of her 23-year-old son. His features had been altered by the fire, his clothing reduced to ash, but Mary leaned over him and spoke the only words a mother could. "I'll see you again one day." That moment, etched forever in the minds of those who witnessed it, captured the depth of a family's loss. Chris Newsom was gone, but his story was only beginning to unfold, because back at the Chipman Street house, Channon Christian was still alive. While Christopher Newsom was marched to his death by the railroad tracks, Channon Christian remained inside the house on Chipman Street. She was kept primarily in the north bedroom, under the watch of Vanessa Coleman. Coleman later claimed she was too afraid to intervene, but investigators believed she played an active role in keeping Channon contained while the men came and went. Channon was restrained and repeatedly assaulted during her captivity. Forensic testimony later revealed the evidence of extreme injuries that could only have come from prolonged physical attacks. Her body bore signs of blunt force trauma, burns from being dragged across carpeted floors, and deep bruises. She was not only held but degraded. At some point, her attackers attempted to erase the evidence of what they had done. Forensic scientists later testified that bleach had been poured down her throat, leaving visible chemical burns, and that her body had been scrubbed with cleaning agents. Investigators concluded this was a deliberate attempt to destroy DNA evidence, particularly in areas where the assaults had left biological traces. Then, in the final hours of her life, Channon was bound more tightly. Strips of bedding and curtains were used to tie her hands and feet in a hog-tied position. Her head was covered with a plastic bag, and her body was forced into large trash bags. She was then stuffed inside a residential garbage can in the kitchen, sheets pulled over the top to conceal her. The medical examiner's testimony was stark. Channon had not died instantly. Instead, she suffocated slowly inside that bin. Her eyes had remained open, a haunting indication that she was conscious as the air slipped away. She had been alive for at least 12 hours after Chris's death, enduring one of the most prolonged ordeals investigators had ever encountered. Meanwhile, Davidson showed no concern for what he had done. He was seen later wearing Chris's Nike shoes and using his cell phone as though they were his own. He even gave Channon's jewelry and some of her belongings to his girlfriend, Daphne Sutton, presenting them as casual gifts. At the time, she thought little of it. Only later, when she learned what had happened, did she realize the truth. For 2 days, Channon and Chris's families waited for answers, growing more desperate as hours passed without a call. They could not have imagined that by the time they were making flyers and calling friends, both of their children were already gone. And when police finally traced the case back to Chipman Street, what they discovered inside that house would confirm the worst fears of everyone who had been searching. In the early hours of January 8th, just after midnight, the Christian family's persistence finally paid off. A small search party of relatives and friends spotted Channon's Toyota 4Runner abandoned near the intersection of Chipman Street and Glider Avenue. It was parked awkwardly, just 2 blocks from a house that neighbors already knew as a trouble spot, and the moment they looked inside, they knew something was terribly wrong. The interior was nothing like the way Channon kept her vehicle. She was meticulous about her car, but now the floorboards were covered in mud and the front seats had been shoved all the way back. At barely 5 feet tall, Channon could never have driven like that. Stickers she had carefully placed on the windows had been peeled away, and items she always kept inside, a teddy bear, her charger, and personal photos, were missing. Whoever had driven it last was not Channon, and they had gone to some effort to strip it of her touches. But what investigators found inside the SUV went beyond subtle clues. On the dashboard sat a pack of Newport cigarettes. Neither Channon nor Chris smoked, and certainly not Newports. It was the first undeniable sign that strangers had been in her car. Then, in the back seat, they found something even more important: an envelope. Investigators collected it, dusted it for prints, and sent it for processing. When the results came back, the name attached to those fingerprints shifted the entire investigation. They belonged to Lamarcus Davidson, a convicted felon who had been released from prison only months earlier, and the envelope carried an address, 2316 Chipman Street. The search for Channon and Chris had gone from a desperate plea for information to a clear lead that pointed directly at a specific house, a house only 2 blocks away from where the SUV had been left. And when police entered that house later that same day, what they uncovered would confirm the family's worst fears and reveal the true horror of what had happened inside. On January 9th, investigators finally acted on the lead from the fingerprints and the envelope that pointed them to 2316 Chipman Street. The house belonged to Lamarcus Davidson, and with a warrant in hand, police moved in. From the outside, it looked like a simple rental, but as soon as officers stepped through the door, they knew it held the answers to the disappearance of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. The place was empty of people, but it reeked of chaos. Drawers were pulled out, clothes scattered, and the atmosphere felt abandoned in a hurry. However, the real discoveries began in the kitchen. There, tucked inside a large residential trash can, wrapped in multiple black garbage bags, was the body of 21-year-old Channon Christian. She had been hidden as though she were refuse, stuffed away by the very people who had taken her life. Detectives who lifted the lid never forgot the sight, and many later admitted it was the most disturbing discovery of their careers. As they moved through the rest of the house, the evidence continued to speak. Chris's driver's license turned up alongside his baseball cap. Channon's purse, her iPod, and personal belongings that her family knew she carried everywhere were scattered through the rooms. These weren't random objects. They were trophies, reminders of what had happened in that house. And then came the ballistic evidence. Shell casings found inside matched the revolver later tied to Chris's execution by the railroad tracks. That connection eliminated any doubt. The murders of both Channon and Chris traced directly back to Chipman Street. Forensic teams combed every surface. They lifted fingerprints, collected fibers, and swabbed for DNA. Davidson's DNA was recovered from Channon's body, confirming his assault. Palm prints on the garbage bags matched his as well, linking him not only to the house, but directly to the way her body had been disposed of. DNA evidence from his half-brother Latalvis Cobbins was also recovered, along with other traces connecting the group. Step by step, the science built the picture of who had been inside the house and what they had done. But even as the evidence mounted, the hardest part was yet to come, telling the families. Officers had to inform Gary and Dina Christian that their daughter had been found and the condition in which she was discovered. Hugh and Mary Newsom, already reeling from the loss of their son, now faced the confirmation that the young woman he loved had been taken in the same brutal sequence of events. Both families described the moment as devastation beyond words. They had clung to the hope that maybe Channon was still alive, but the discovery at Chipman Street erased that hope forever. The case had shifted from a desperate search for two missing young adults to a homicide investigation with physical evidence, forensic confirmation, and a trail that pointed directly at Lamarcus Davidson and those around him. But the manhunt for the suspects was only just beginning. Once investigators uncovered the evidence inside 2316 Chipman Street, the search for the suspects intensified. Lamarcus Davidson was the first target. Detectives quickly learned he had abandoned the house on Chipman and was hiding out in a vacant property on Reynolds Street. When officers finally stormed the building, Davidson was found crouched inside, wearing Christopher Newsom's Nike shoes as though they were his own. Alongside him, investigators recovered the .22 caliber revolver that ballistics confirmed had fired the shots that killed Chris. Davidson's attempt to lie low had only tied him more directly to the crimes. But Davidson hadn't acted alone, and the hunt spread beyond Knoxville. His half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, and their friend George Thomas had fled across state lines to Lebanon, Kentucky. Authorities tracked them through phone records and intercepted communications, and when they closed in, both men were taken into custody without incident. At the time of their arrest, investigators seized a computer showing they had been monitoring media reports of the murders. They also recovered Channon's overnight bag and more of the couple's belongings, confirming their hands-on involvement. The fourth suspect, Vanessa Coleman, was arrested soon afterward. She had traveled with Cobbins and Thomas, and when investigators searched her belongings, they found something chilling, a handwritten journal. Inside, Coleman had described her time in Knoxville as one hell of an adventure. For prosecutors, the diary erased any doubt about her awareness of what had taken place inside the Chipman Street house. While she would later insist she was merely a bystander, the words in her own handwriting told a different story. Eric Boyd, the fifth figure connected to the group, was initially treated more cautiously. Federal prosecutors focused first on his role in helping Davidson hide after the crimes, charging him as an accessory. Boyd insisted he had no involvement in the murders themselves, but detectives kept digging. Over time, witness testimony and forensic evidence placed him closer to the crimes than he had admitted, and his name would resurface later in a much larger way. By mid-January 2007, all 5 suspects were in custody. What had begun as a frantic search for 2 missing young people had become a full-scale homicide case with arrests spanning multiple states. And as the charges mounted, so did the complexity of the legal battle that lay ahead. Because bringing these suspects to trial would prove almost as grueling for the families as the crimes themselves. However, as the investigation moved toward trial, a new debate began to unfold outside the courtroom, one that threatened to overshadow the case itself. The suspects were black, and the victims were white, and for many observers, that fact alone raised questions about motive. People asked whether Chris Newsom and Channon Christian had been targeted because of their race, but the debate did not remain confined to reasonable discussion. White supremacist groups quickly seized on the tragedy and twisted it to fit their own agenda. Online forums spread false claims about what had been done to the couple, including fabricated stories of castration and mutilation. None of those details were supported by forensic reports, but once they were circulated, they spread quickly and even found their way into some news coverage. For the families of Channon and Chris, this exploitation of their children's suffering was unbearable. They had already lost everything, and now they had to watch as extremists used their names to promote hate. Gary Christian, Channon's father, confronted it directly. When asked about the rallies and slogans, he cut through the noise with a simple statement: "It ain't about you." His words made clear that the families did not want their grief to be turned into a weapon for someone else's cause. Authorities also addressed the question of motive. The Knoxville Chief of Police and the Knox County Sheriff both emphasized that there was no evidence the crimes were racially driven. Investigators concluded that Chris and Channon had been targeted because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that the attack had been a crime of opportunity, a carjacking that escalated into something far worse. By 2008, more than a year after the murders, the Christian and Newsom families were still waiting for justice. The first to face a jury was Eric Boyd. Unlike the others, he was not charged with murder at that time. Prosecutors argued that his role had been to help Lamarcus Davidson hide in the days after the crime, and to shield him from capture. In April 2008, he was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact and was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. But even as that verdict was read, both families made clear they believed his involvement went far deeper. Then, in August 2009, it was Latalvis Cobbins who went on trial. Prosecutors described him as Davidson's half-brother and as the man who had actively participated in the assaults. Forensic evidence tied him directly to Channon through DNA samples recovered from her clothing and body. Cobbins took the stand in his own defense, and in one of the most disturbing moments of the trial, he claimed that what had happened was consensual. He argued that Channon had agreed in exchange for being let go. But his story collapsed under its own weight. Even in his account, he admitted he had not kept the supposed promise to release her. The jury saw through it and convicted him of Channon's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Only 2 months later, in October 2009, the case against Lamarcus Davidson began. He was presented as the ringleader, the man who had drawn the others into his rented house at 2316 Chipman Street, and the one most responsible for what unfolded inside. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints on Channon's SUV, his palm print on the trash bag that held her body, his DNA recovered in multiple samples, and the revolver found in his possession that matched the bullets taken from Chris's body. The courtroom heard detailed forensic testimony about Channon's injuries and Chris's final hours.
Dr. Blusnick, again, I would ask, based upon your training, your experience, your expertise, I would like to ask you a series of hypothetical questions. If expert from TBI has testified, that this area with the black magic marker is semen, sperm, on the lower left leg of the pants. Would that be consistent with Miss Christian in a seated position with sperm in her mouth, leaning forward and spitting the sperm out?
Yes, it could be consistent.
What effect could bleach have on sperm?
Well, the bleach would be destructive.
How so?
Because of the chemical properties and the influence on the bonds in the DNA.
Okay, let me ask you one more question. And again, Dr. Blusnick, if Jennifer Millsaps with TBI has testified that the inside of the camisole, underneath the breast portion, in between the breasts, and this spot on the sweater right in here, tested positive for Latavas Cobbins' DNA. And this spot here on the inner left thigh tested positive for Latavas Cobbins' DNA. Would that be consistent with Ms. Christian in a seated position with sperm in her mouth, spitting it out, it getting into the inside of the bra, inside the camisole, settling in the bra portion of the camisole, and getting on the front of her sweater and the inner left thigh?
It's consistent. It could be one of the ways, yes.
But that was not all. She took her time to explain why it was not consensual based on the evidences.
And then again, on the back of the Big Star jeans, there is some DNA that is consistent with Miss Christian's DNA. Would that be consistent with a cut hand that is bleeding, touching the back of her pants in that area and leaving blood?
It could be.
If her hands were tied, would that also be consistent?
Sure.
And also, inside in the interior of the jeans, Ms. Millsaps found DNA that is consistent with Mr. Davidson in the crotch area. Would that be consistent again with Mr. Davidson's sperm being inside Ms. Christian in her vaginal area or her anal area, and then putting the pants back on after Mr. Davidson deposited semen in her vagina and her anus?
Yes.
Thank you. Let's put these back.
The photos from the autopsy were played out on a large movie-sized screen, almost play-by-play. Every, as each layer of binding is removed and as each trash bag is removed, there's a new photo and close-up shots, and they're very graphic, and they were so graphic, in fact, that a new prosecutor who's assisting in this case grew faint early on into the autopsy presentation of Shannon Christian's death.
And at 23:06.
The evidence was so graphic that one prosecutor fainted during the presentation of autopsy photographs, and another person in the courtroom had to be helped out.
We have a doctor in that.
And so we had to take a break in order to help her to recover. She did not return to the courtroom, however.
The family sat through it all, hearing clinical descriptions of their children's final moments. For them, it was unbearable, but they refused to leave. They wanted to see justice through to the end. Davidson's defense team tried to argue that Chris and Shannon had willingly come to his house to buy drugs, but toxicology reports and testimony about their characters quickly dismantled that claim. In the end, the jury found him guilty on 35 of 38 counts, including the murders of both victims. On October 28, 2009, Davidson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Judge Richard Baumgartner told him in open court that there was no sentence great enough to punish you for the conduct you have been convicted of. George Thomas went to trial next. He admitted that he had been present in the house but denied participating in the assaults. He claimed he was merely a bystander. However, circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and his close involvement with Cobbins and Davidson convinced the jury otherwise. In December 2009, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The final defendant was Vanessa Coleman, Cobbins' girlfriend. She was only 18 at the time of the murders, and she argued that she had been too afraid to intervene. She claimed she had been threatened and forced to stay in the house against her will, but prosecutors presented her diary, written after the crimes, in which she described her time in Knoxville as one hell of an adventure. Those words destroyed any chance of convincing the jury she had been a passive bystander. In July 2010, she was convicted of facilitation of murder and sentenced to 53 years in prison. However, just as the families began to believe that the worst was finally over, the ground shifted beneath them once again. In 2011, the very judge who had presided over all 4 state trials, Richard Baumgartner, was exposed for a secret life that shook Tennessee's legal system. Investigators revealed that Baumgartner had been struggling with an addiction to prescription painkillers, and not only was he using them while on the bench, he had been obtaining the drugs illegally from a convicted felon who had appeared in his courtroom. Accusations also surfaced that he had traded favors for sex during court breaks. His misconduct had stretched across years, including the very period when he oversaw the trials of the Christian Newsom defendants. So Baumgartner resigned in disgrace. By March 2011, he pleaded guilty to official misconduct and was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison. He was disbarred and stripped of his robe, but the damage he had caused went far beyond his own downfall. His misconduct opened the door for defense attorneys to argue that the convictions of Davidson, Cobbins, Thomas, and Coleman were now tainted. And in December of that year, the nightmare returned. A new judge, John Carey Blackwood, ruled that all 4 defendants were entitled to retrials because Baumgartner had been under the influence while presiding. Families who had sat through every excruciating detail of the first proceedings were told they would have to endure it all over again. The retrials unfolded in 2012. Vanessa Coleman faced the jury once more. This time, she was again convicted, but of slightly lesser charges, and her sentence was reduced from 53 years to 35. George Thomas also returned to court. He was convicted once again, and the judge imposed 2 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 25 years. For Davidson and Cobbins, however, the courts ultimately upheld their original sentences. Davidson remained on death row, while Cobbins continued serving life without parole. So, while justice had not been undone, the process had forced the families back into the same courtrooms, reliving the same agony, listening to the same evidence. Gary Christian later described the retrials as salt in an open wound, and yet they endured, determined to see the sentences stand. But the saga was still not finished. Another name that had once seemed minor in the early days of the case was about to reemerge. Eric Boyd, originally treated as nothing more than an accessory, would soon face a very different reckoning. For years, Boyd had escaped the full weight of accountability. He had been convicted only in federal court for harboring Davidson and received an 18-year sentence. But as the retrials unfolded and new testimony surfaced, prosecutors finally had what they needed. George Thomas, already serving life sentences, agreed to testify against Boyd in exchange for a reduced punishment, and his account placed Boyd squarely at the center of Christopher Newsom's final hours. So, in 2019, 12 years after the murders, Eric Boyd was indicted in Knox County on 36 counts, including first-degree murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. The trial stretched through the summer, with jurors hearing not only Thomas's testimony but also forensic evidence and statements from witnesses who confirmed Boyd's role that night. On August 13th, 2019, the verdict came. Boyd was found guilty on nearly all charges. Judge Bob McGee called him the worst of the worst and sentenced him to 2 life terms plus an additional 90 years, ensuring he would never leave prison alive. For the families, it was both relief and exhaustion. Mary Newsom stood and said, "I always knew he killed my son." And Gary Christian, his voice heavy but resolute, declared, "We got them all. That's what I promised my daughter." With Boyd's conviction, every person involved in the Christian Newsom murders had finally been held accountable. Justice had not erased the pain, but it had closed a chapter that the families had been forced to live through for more than a decade. The physical reminder of the crime, the house at 2316 Chipman Street, did not stand for long. In 2008, it was demolished, and in its place, a memorial was built to honor Channon and Chris. What had once been a site of terror was remade into a space of remembrance. But the families did not stop at memorials. They turned their grief into action, ensuring that the legacies of their children lived on. the Channon Gale Christian Foundation created scholarships for University of Tennessee students, often celebrated with the golf tournaments she loved. The Chris Newsom Memorial Baseball Foundation sponsored an annual tournament at Halls Community Park, offering dozens of scholarships to young athletes who carried his love for the game forward. And in the courtroom, the memory of Channon and Chris reshaped Tennessee law. The Channon Christian Act was passed to protect victims from smear campaigns during trial, blocking defense attorneys from making unsubstantiated claims about a victim's past. And the Chris Newsom Act eliminated the 13th juror rule, ensuring that no judge could override a unanimous jury verdict the way Baumgartner's misconduct had once threatened to. So the names of Channon and Chris were carried into classrooms, baseball fields, and law books, a testament to how their families refused to let tragedy have the final word. The grief never ended, but neither did the determination to honor their lives. Evil had tried to erase them. Instead, their legacy became stronger with every year. 18 years later, Knoxville still remembers, because some names should never be forgotten: Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Now we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have been done to prevent something like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. We read every single one of them. And if this story moved you, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories just like this one. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourself and stay safe. Cheers.
And beaten, a jury says a McLean County woman is guilty of kicking her boyfriend's daughter to death. We do want to warn you, you may find some of the video in this case disturbing.
On the night of January 25th, 2019, 8-year-old Rika Roundtree was rushed to Advocate Broman Hospital in Illinois. She had been complaining of stomach pain for days, but now she was unresponsive. When doctors examined her, they found a deep bruise across her abdomen, the kind of injury no child should ever have. She was quickly transferred to a larger hospital in Peoria, where a surgical team tried to save her. They opened her abdomen and found extensive internal damage. The operation lasted as long as it could, but Rika's small body could not survive the trauma. Just after midnight, she was gone. An autopsy was ordered, and what the pathologist discovered told a devastating story. Rika's body carried 67 separate marks from head to toe, scars that revealed not a single injury but a long pattern of. And when investigators pressed further, they uncovered something even more disturbing: cell phone videos showing the little girl being humiliated, punished, and hurt inside her own home. The images were so graphic that even seasoned detectives described them as unforgettable. So how did an 8-year-old end up here, despite years of warnings? But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Rika J. Roundtree was born on April 16, 2010, at St. Joseph's Hospital in Bloomington, Illinois. She came into the world at just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the youngest of 5 children and the only girl in the family. From the very beginning, she held a special place among her siblings, because while her 4 older brothers sometimes teased and roughhoused, they also knew she was different. She was the little sister who lit up every room she walked into. Her family remembered her as bubbly and energetic, but also remarkably independent for her age. She did not wait for someone else to hand her happiness. She created it for herself. Rika found joy in the simplest things, and she made those around her feel it too. What set her apart most was her imagination. She adored dolls, and she treated them as if they were real children. She would take pride in going to local yard sales, where she searched for strollers, car seats, bottles, and tiny clothes to add to her collection. She didn't just play with them for a few minutes and then move on. She cared for them as if they were her own. Family members said she would even ask her mother to buy diapers for her dolls when they went to the store because she wanted to give them the same attention and protection she knew babies needed. As her mother once explained, her dolls were her babies and she treated them as such. But Rika wasn't only a child lost in her own world of make-believe. She had a huge heart for the people around her too. She teased her brothers and laughed easily, but she also wanted to protect the ones she loved. Even at a young age, she showed that she was capable of giving the kind of loyalty and affection that most adults would be proud of.
It's like an sound. Can you see something blue looking at me? I think Charles needs to put on it. He looks so ugly.
Stop playing with me.
And he looks like a monkey.
However, that same little girl who poured her love into her dolls and who gave her energy so freely to others needed the same kind of protection and care in return. And as the years unfolded, that protection failed her at almost every level. The warning signs around Rika's family began years before her death, and each time the state was alerted, an opportunity to protect her slipped away. In June 2014, the Department of Children and Family Services, or DCFS, became involved after one of Rika's older brothers was sent to a psychiatric hospital following a violent altercation at home. He told authorities that he had been choked and thrown through a screen door during a fight. The case was serious enough to appear on DCFS's official timeline, but Rika's mother, Ann Simmons, disputed the account. She said what actually drew attention that summer was the strange punishments used in the household. According to her, Richard Roundtree, Rika's father, sometimes forced the children to stand holding cans of food out at arm's length until their muscles gave out. To outsiders, it looked harsh, but inside the family, it was treated as discipline. Just a few months later, in September 2014, DCFS was called again. This time, Richard and Ann were reported for fighting physically in front of their children. Police became involved, but like the earlier incident, the case was closed as unfounded. Then in October 2015, the cycle repeated. A complaint was filed after more violence broke out in front of the children. Richard was arrested on a DV charge, but his case was dropped, and once again DCFS marked the allegations as unsubstantiated. By the end of that year, Ann's personal struggles were beginning to take over her life. Her alcohol use had gotten worse, and in December she was cited for driving with a suspended license after she ran a stop sign. Only days later, she drove on the wrong side of the road and collided head-on with another car. She was intoxicated, arrested, and charged with aggravated DUI. The mother of 5 now had criminal charges and court obligations hanging over her, and her home life grew more unstable by the day. So the family came under more scrutiny. In December 2015, Ann began receiving emergency cash assistance from a program for at-risk families. It was meant to help her provide housing and essentials so she could keep her children in her care. But by 2016, more problems had surfaced. In June of that year, DCFS investigated another call after reports that Ann had encouraged one of her sons to fight a neighbor's child. The investigation ended like the others, closed as unfounded. However, a more serious case appeared in April 2016, when court records alleged that one of Rika's brothers, still a minor, had assaulted another child while living out of state. Although this allegation did not involve Rika directly, it showed that her household was under stress and already drawing intervention. By September 2016, things reached a breaking point. Police raided Ann's home after undercover officers purchased from her boyfriend, Deontay Harper. Both adults were arrested and Ann was sentenced to 68 days in jail, while Harper was given 6 years in prison. 2 children, including Rika, were present during the raid. That moment changed everything for Rika because she was placed into the custody of her father, Richard Roundtree, and his longtime girlfriend, Cynthia Cindy Baker. So at only 6 years old, Rika's life was uprooted. She left her mother's care and entered a household where discipline was already harsh and DCFS already had a history of contact. Ann struggled on probation and with her addiction, but she still tried to remain in her daughter's life. And this was only the beginning. By 2017, Rika had been living with her father, Richard Roundtree, and his girlfriend, Cynthia Cindy Baker, for nearly a year, and the strain was already showing. She was only 7 years old, but she had started voicing fears that no child should have had to carry. Rika told her mother, Ann Simmons, that Cindy whipped her with a belt and that Richard sometimes joined in by forcing her to stand for long periods holding heavy cans of food out in front of her until her arms shook with exhaustion. What had once been spoken of as discipline inside the household was now surfacing as cruelty that seemed designed to break a child down. Ann became alarmed, and in July 2017 she contacted the police. Rika was briefly removed from Richard and Cindy's home during the investigation, and for a short time she stayed with her mother. Anne later said that during those days she felt her daughter was safe, because Rika seemed more relaxed and relieved just to be back in an environment where she was not terrified of the people around her. However, the safety did not last. When DCFS investigated the claims, they concluded that there was no credible evidence of and the case was closed as unfounded. With that decision, Rika was returned to her father's home, back under the care of Cindy Baker. The change in Rika after that point was unmistakable. Anne later described how her daughter's personality shifted dramatically. Rika had once been carefree, imaginative, and bold, but now she became cautious and withdrawn. She no longer carried the same lightness in her laughter, and she seemed to weigh her words more carefully, as if she was always anticipating a consequence for saying the wrong thing. Anne said, "She was different. She was more reserved. She was really cautious about a lot of stuff, whereas before she was carefree." Teachers and others around Rika also began noticing differences in her demeanor. She was quieter, less likely to speak up, and more hesitant in situations where she used to show confidence. The transformation was not sudden, but it was steady, and it reflected a child who was adapting to an environment of fear rather than one of love. So by the end of 2017, there had already been reports to police, investigations by DCFS, and visible changes in Rika's behavior. By the spring of 2018, the changes in Rika were no longer hidden inside the walls of her father's house. They were now visible to anyone who looked closely enough. In April, Anne Simmons decided to visit her daughter at school, and what she saw left her stunned. Rika's once bright face showed signs of physical trauma, with injuries to her mouth and eyes. There were also marks on her neck. Even her hair, which Anne remembered as long and lively, had been cut down almost to her scalp. Anne could hardly recognize her little girl, but when DCFS came to investigate, Rika gave an explanation that sounded rehearsed. She told them that the injuries were accidents, that she had bumped her head on a medicine cabinet or fallen into a drawer. She denied that anyone had hurt her, and she insisted she wasn't afraid of anyone at home. DCFS accepted her answers, and just like the cases before, this one was marked unfounded and closed. So Rika was sent right back into the same environment that had raised those alarms in the first place. Then, in October 2018, another disturbing development surfaced. Anne later said that her ex-husband Richard made it clear he no longer wanted to be a father to Rika at all. He told her that she should find a knight in shining armor to take Rika in, because he didn't want the responsibility of child support, visitation, or any of the obligations that came with raising his daughter. He wanted her adopted out so he could walk away completely. Around the same time, the tension between Cindy Baker and Rika seemed to escalate. Staff at Fox Creek Elementary noticed that Rika did not have a proper winter coat, so they provided her with one. It was a small gesture of kindness, but when Cindy found out, she stormed into the school in a rage. She accused the staff of favoring Rika over her own daughter, who already had a coat. What for most parents would have been a moment of gratitude instead became another sign of hostility. The warning signs kept multiplying. In December 2018, just weeks after the coat incident, Rika came to school with 2 black eyes. Her teachers immediately reported the injuries, knowing this was not the first time they had seen unexplained marks on her. DCFS was called yet again, but when Baker was instructed to take Rika for x-rays, she refused. Despite the refusal and the mounting pattern of injuries, DCFS still closed the investigation as unfounded. Rika stayed in the home, and no protective action was taken. Cindy's response was swift. After the school raised concerns about the black eyes, she pulled both her own daughter and Rika out of Fox Creek Elementary. She enrolled them instead at Prairieland Elementary in Normal, about 20 minutes north, a move that coincided with the family's relocation to 407 Stanhope Lane. The transfer cut off Fox Creek staff from monitoring Rika's condition, and it placed her in a new environment where the history of warnings was not fully known. It was at Prairieland where teacher Suzanne Schertz noticed how quickly Rika seemed to be fading. Schertz later testified that during the short 12 days Rika attended her class, she saw troubling signs. Rika often looked exhausted, and she sometimes lay down on the classroom carpet as if she could not keep herself upright. To Schertz, it was obvious that something was wrong. So by the end of 2018, the cycle had repeated again and again. Visible injuries, reports from schools, investigations that went nowhere, and a child who continued to deteriorate before everyone's eyes. But instead of receiving protection, Rika was left in a place where each new report only seemed to tighten Cindy Baker's control. By January of 2019, Ann Simmons was still fighting for her daughter, but her own legal troubles had caught up with her. That month, a judge reviewed her probation violations stemming from her aggravated DUI, along with a separate forgery charge, and determined that she had not made enough progress to turn her life around. He sentenced her to 2.5 years in prison. For Ann, it meant that the custody battle she had waged for years was suddenly over. She could no longer fight for Rika's return. As the judge said, her efforts had been too little, too late. And for Rika, it meant she was left fully in the custody of her father and Cindy Baker, with no immediate path out. Then, just weeks later, Rika's health began to fail. In the days leading up to January 25th, she had been vomiting and complaining of severe stomach pain. At one point, Cindy claimed that Rika nearly fell down the stairs and was having trouble seeing, but instead of seeking help, Cindy brushed off her condition, telling investigators later that the little girl often faked being sick for attention. So Rika was kept at home, growing weaker, while the adults around her dismissed her suffering. On the night of January 25th, everything changed. Rika became unresponsive, and finally an ambulance was called. She was rushed first to Advocate Bro Men Hospital in Bloomington. Doctors there immediately saw the large bruise on her abdomen and knew her condition was critical. She was stabilized and quickly transferred to a larger facility in Peoria for emergency surgery. In the early hours of January 26th, surgeons opened her abdomen and saw the extent of the damage. Her intestines were badly injured, and infection had already spread through her body. They worked to repair the trauma, but her small body had endured too much. Despite their efforts, Rika died on the operating table. She was just 8 years old. An autopsy was performed by Dr. Matthew Fox, and his findings confirmed what the doctors had seen. Rika had died from peritonitis, a deadly infection caused by blunt force trauma to her abdomen. But the damage was not limited to that single blow. Her body carried 67 separate marks, scars, and bruises from head to toe, evidence of repeat over time. Each injury told part of a longer story, one that revealed her final days were not an isolated tragedy, but the result of years of violence and neglect. So by the end of January 2019, a little girl who loved dolls and yard sales was gone, and the system that was meant to protect her had failed again. When Rika died, investigators immediately turned their attention to the 2 adults responsible for her care. Richard Roundtree and his girlfriend Cynthia Cindy Baker were interviewed about what had happened inside their home. Both of them denied causing any harm. They claimed Rika had been sick, that she sometimes faked illness, and that whatever had happened was not the result of. Their stories were flat, but investigators knew something did not add up. So the investigation widened. Over the next 3 months, police combed through the family's home, reviewed records, and examined digital evidence. What they found changed the entire case. On Cindy's cell phone were videos, undeniable proof of what had been happening behind closed doors. One video showed Rika stripped naked, wet, and shivering. She was forced to hold heavy cans out in front of her body, the same punishment her father had once used on the other children. When her small arms began to drop, Cindy slapped her across the face and sneered, "Do I need to put a collar on you?" The words caught on camera made it clear that this was not discipline. It was humiliation and control. Another recording captured Cindy dragging Rika across the floor by her neck and pulling her into a bedroom. In yet another, Cindy kneed Rika in the back, forcing her against the wall until her head struck it. The violence was deliberate, and the tone was mocking. What made it worse was that Rika was not only abused, but also ridiculed by others in the house. In some of the recordings, other children could be heard laughing and taunting her as the abuse unfolded. Instead of protection, Rika was treated as a target. Her suffering turned into a spectacle. The videos left no doubt. Rika had been living in a home where cruelty was normalized and where her pain was entertainment. And she was not the only child in danger. 4 other children were living in the house at the time: Cindy's teenage son, her 2 daughters, and the baby she shared with Richard. After the charges were filed, those children were removed by the state for their own safety. For investigators, the cell phone footage was the turning point. No matter what Richard and Cindy said, the videos told the truth. The violence was not an accident, and the harm had been repeated, intentional and severe. By April 2019, the evidence investigators had gathered left prosecutors with no choice but to act. Cindy Baker was formally charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder, aggravated domestic battery, and domestic battery of a child. The charges reflected not just Rika's death, but the pattern of abuse that had been captured on her phone. A McLean County judge set her bond at $1 million, and Cindy was taken into custody at the county jail, awaiting trial. But Cindy was not the only one under scrutiny. As investigators reviewed the household, they determined that Richard Roundtree had also failed to protect his daughter. He had been present for punishments, aware of the abuse, and still left Rika in harm's way. So later that year, Richard was indicted on charges of child endangerment, a decision that acknowledged his role in the neglect that allowed the abuse to continue. At the same time, the Department of Children and Family Services conducted its own review. For the first time, both Cindy and Richard were indicated for abuse and neglect, which meant the agency concluded there was credible evidence they were responsible for Rika's injuries and death. It was a reversal from years of unfounded decisions, and it came too late to save Rika. So by the spring of 2019, the case had shifted from questions to accountability. Cindy now faced the possibility of life in prison. Richard was under indictment for failing to protect his own daughter, and DCFS itself was under fire for the repeated failures that had left Rika in that home. By the fall of 2019, the case against Cynthia "Cindy" Baker moved into the courtroom. In October, her trial began in McLean County, and over the following weeks, jurors were confronted with the full weight of the evidence. From the start, prosecutors Erica Reynolds and Mary Cole laid out their case. Rika Roundtree had not died from an accident or an illness, but from a pattern of abuse that escalated until it took her life. To prove it, they showed the jury what investigators had found on Cindy's own phone. One by one, the videos were played in court. Jurors saw Rika, only 8 years old, stripped naked, shivering, and forced to hold cans until her arms dropped. They saw Cindy slap her across the face and heard her taunt, "Do I need to put a collar on you?" They saw Cindy dragging Rika by the neck into a bedroom, and in another clip, kneeing her in the back and slamming her head against a wall.
Evidence presented showed Cynthia Baker regularly beat 8-year-old Rika Roundtree before her death. That took place at the home that Baker and Rika's father both shared. Video of the along with other evidence was enough to convince a 12-person jury beyond a reasonable doubt.
We, the jury, find the defendant Cynthia Baker guilty of the offense of first-degree murder. It is signed by the 4-person and other 11 jurors.
Cynthia now awaits a February court date where she will learn her punishment. She faces a sentence of up to 200 years.
Altogether, and the bottom line is this is child abuse. This is repetitive injury to a child over numerous, I would say, weeks.
Doctors say Rika died from a kick to the stomach. Testimony and video evidence suggests Cynthia did not do this alone. Detectives presented text messages between Baker and Rika's father.
Would life be better without Rika? Defendant. I don't know. I don't want to say yes. That is your daughter.
The day Richard Roundtree was supposed to testify, he handed a letter to the Normal Police Department in which Baker asked him to take the blame for everything.
For the jury, the videos were impossible to look away from, and they painted a picture no denial could erase. Then came the testimony. Teachers took the stand and explained how they had seen the signs long before Rika's death. Black eyes, exhaustion, and the look of a child who was slowly shutting down. Prosecutors used their accounts to show how the abuse had been visible, and yet nothing had stopped it. Medical experts added even more weight. Forensic pathologist Dr. Scott Denton, who performed Rika's second autopsy, told the jury that her body was essentially a crime scene. He explained the 67 scars and marks across her body and detailed the internal injuries that caused her death. Pediatric surgeon Dr. Charles Abrahamian also testified, recalling the desperate hours in January 2019 when he tried to save her life. He said he had seen injuries like Rika's only in cases of blunt force abdominal trauma and told the jury that her wounds had been inflicted days before she arrived at the hospital. The most devastating testimony came from Cindy's own children. Her 6-year-old daughter described watching her mother kick Rika in the stomach, whip her with a belt, and then laugh while Rika cried in pain. Her 17-year-old son testified that Rika was often hungry, that she was not allowed to do the same things as the other children, and that she was singled out in the household as different, as less. Prosecutors also introduced text messages exchanged between Richard Roundtree and Cindy, which showed they both knew about the mistreatment and discussed Rika in ways that confirmed her unequal treatment. The case built piece by piece, each layer reinforcing what the videos had already made undeniable. And on November 19, 2019, after deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Cindy Baker was found guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated battery, endangering the life of a child, and multiple counts of domestic battery. So the trial ended with a conviction, but for many, the images of Rika in those videos and the words of those who testified could never be forgotten. After her conviction, Cindy Baker returned to court for sentencing. The judge handed down the maximum penalty, life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was transferred to Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, where she remains to this day. But the case did not end with her. In February 2020, Richard Roundtree stood before a judge and pled guilty to charges of child. He admitted that he had failed to protect his daughter, even as the unfolded in front of him. The court sentenced him to 8 years in prison. During that hearing, Ann Simmons, Rika's mother, gave a victim impact statement. Looking directly at the man who had once been her husband, she said, "Whatever the sentence is, it will never be enough. Rika was 8 years old and you were her dad. You were supposed to protect her from the pain that you brought to her. I feel like you deserve to die in prison." Richard offered only a brief response. Through his attorney, he had a statement read aloud. "I should have protected her better, and I'm sorry." But even that accountability was short-lived. By October 2022, Richard was released on parole after serving just 2.5 years of his 8-year sentence. For many who had followed the case, the release felt like another failure, another example of the system minimizing the weight of what had been lost. In the months after Rika's death and the convictions, attention turned to the failures that had allowed her to continue. The Department of Children and Family Services admitted that multiple investigations into Rika's home had all been labeled unfounded, even when injuries and complaints kept surfacing. One investigator, Patricia Shannon, was found to have mishandled critical parts of Rika's case. She never interviewed the teacher who reported Rika's injuries, and she failed to conduct separate interviews of Richard and Cindy, as required by policy. For those failures, she received a 7-day suspension. But soon after, Shannon was promoted to a higher administrative role, with a significant salary increase. The decision shocked many who believed accountability should have meant removal, not advancement. Ann Simmons filed a federal lawsuit against DCFS, accusing the agency of wrongful death and of violating her daughter's civil rights by leaving her in danger. Rika's case became one of the most cited examples of systemic breakdown because she was not alone. In fact, she was one of 123 children in Illinois who died within a single year after having contact with DCFS between 2018 and 2019. Lawmakers responded with promises of reform. The state budget for DCFS was increased by $130 million, and new staff were promised to reduce the caseload for investigators. Prosecutors, police, and inspectors all used Rika's case as proof that the agency's failures were not isolated mistakes, but part of a larger, broken system. As one prosecutor put it, defaulting to what a child says, when that child is terrified, will always miss the truth. Even after justice was delivered in court, the way Rika's life was honored remained painful. Richard and Cindy arranged no funeral, no obituary, and her body was cremated quickly after the autopsy. For a time, it seemed as though the little girl would simply disappear from public memory. But the community refused to let that happen. In January 2020, dozens of people gathered outside the house on Stanhope Lane where Rika had lived and suffered. They lit candles, held hands, and released balloons in her favorite color into the winter sky. For many, it was the funeral she never had. A year later, on what would have been Rika's 11th birthday in April 2021, Ann Simmons and community members organized a day of play. Families came together in a local park with music, games, and face painting, things Rika herself had loved. Ann explained her choice, saying, Her death was horrible, but Rika liked to have fun. I just want to show happiness in her memory. Through vigils, balloon releases, and birthdays celebrated in her absence, Rika's name continued to be spoken. And for those who gathered, it was not just about remembering her, but about demanding that no other child should be failed in the way she was. Cynthia Baker now serves life without parole. Richard Roundtree walked free after just 2.5 years, and the Department of Children and Family Services continues to face scrutiny for its role in leaving Rika unprotected. What remains is the impact of a little girl who should have grown up surrounded by safety and love, but instead was let down again and again. She was only 8 years old. She asked for help more than once, and every time the system told her the abuse was unfounded. So what do you think about this case? We'd love to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments because every voice matters here, and I can assure you that we read every single one of them. And who knows, your comment might help someone else reflect on the hidden realities of these cases. If you found this story important, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into cases like this one. Until next time, cheers and stay safe.
Between 1977 and 1991, Shipman killed 71 patients. In the last 6 years before his arrest, while working as a sole practitioner at the Market Street Surgery in Hyde, he killed 143. Of the 215 known victims, 171 were women and 44 were men.
It was supposed to be a routine visit, the kind that happened every week in the small English town of Hyde. 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy welcomed her doctor in, grateful for the man who had cared for half the town. Dr. Harold Shipman chatted with her for a few minutes, checked her pulse, and soon after, quietly left the house, but by the afternoon, Kathleen was gone. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, received the call that her mother had died peacefully of old age. It was sudden, but Shipman had been there, and everyone trusted him. But a few days later, as Angela went through her mother's papers, she found something that made her heart race, a new will, typed and oddly formal, leaving every penny of her mother's £400,000 estate to Dr. Harold Shipman. Kathleen's signature looked strange, and her mother never typed letters, never used legal phrases, never left out her family, so something was terribly wrong. Angela went to the police, still unable to believe that the man who had signed the death certificate might be responsible for the death itself. And that single piece of paper would open the door to one of the most disturbing investigations in British history. For more than 20 years, Harold Shipman had been quietly killing his own patients, hundreds of them, while the system looked the other way. So how did the most respected doctor in town become the most prolific serial killer in modern Britain? But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. For most people in Hyde, Harold Shipman was more than a doctor. He was part of the rhythm of their lives. He made his rounds in a dark suit, carrying his worn black medical bag, and he was always on time. If he said he'd be there at 10, you could look out the window and see his car pull up on the dot. Patients often said, you could set your clock by him. He treated everyone the same way, whether it was an elderly widow living alone, a young mother with her first child, or a worried husband who needed reassurance. So when he certified death, no one ever doubted his judgment. And when he prescribed morphine, no one questioned it. It was Shipman, and he knew best. To the people of Hyde, he wasn't just a doctor, he was the keeper of their health, the man who had looked after them for generations. But as the funerals multiplied and his name appeared again and again on certificates, no one saw a pattern. In a town where people trusted him completely, Harold Shipman was hiding in plain sight. And so, for years, his patients continued to invite him into their homes, offering him tea, conversation, and complete trust, never realizing that each visit carried a risk they could never have imagined. But the man they trusted was hiding something that had started decades earlier. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, into a modest working-class family. His father, Harold Shipman Sr., worked as a lorry driver, while his mother, Vera, stayed at home, running the household with quiet discipline. They lived in a small council house on the outskirts of town, where expectations were simple but firm. Work hard, stay decent, and make something of yourself. From a young age, Harold stood out. He wasn't loud or mischievous like other boys in his class. Instead, he was meticulous and serious. Teachers remembered him as bright but detached, the kind of student who followed every rule yet kept to himself. And while most children spent afternoons playing outside, Harold preferred solitary routines, reading, counting, organizing, always seeking order where others found chaos. Vera, his mother, was the center of his world. She was proud, proper, and protective of her son, seeing in him the promise of a better life. She pushed him to excel at school and reminded him often that he was destined for something greater. Their bond was intense, built on admiration and control. She guided every aspect of his life, and he seemed to thrive under her attention. But that world began to collapse when Vera developed lung cancer. Harold was 17. He watched her health decline with a quiet panic he never showed anyone. Doctors prescribed morphine injections to manage her pain, and every evening he watched as the drug transformed her, from the strong, commanding woman he knew into someone fragile and fading. The young Harold sat by her bedside, observing how the morphine soothed her suffering, how it seemed to take her from agony to calm within moments. It fascinated him, the power of a simple injection to bring relief, to ease control over life and death. And when the end finally came, something inside him shifted. His childhood friend, Michael Heath, remembered the moment vividly. He said, "He came to me one evening and said, 'My mom's dead.' Then he went for a run, in the rain, like nothing had happened. There were no tears, no visible grief, only distance, an emotional silence that stayed with him for the rest of his life." After Vera's death, Harold's world became colder, but more focused. He buried himself in routine, the way his mother had taught him. Running became his ritual. He ran for miles through the streets of Nottingham, not for fitness or sport, but to escape the emptiness. Those who knew him said he seemed calmer after those long runs, as though the repetition offered him control when everything else felt uncertain. When the time came to choose a career, medicine felt inevitable. It was his mother's dream for him, and now it became his mission. He was accepted into Leeds Medical School in 1965, where he stood out for his sharp intelligence and his rigid sense of order. During those years, he met Primrose Oxtoby, a kind and plain-spoken young woman from Yorkshire. They met on a bus, and she was drawn to his calm, almost old-fashioned manner. Their relationship moved quickly, and when she became pregnant, Harold married her without hesitation. He was just 21. It wasn't a grand romance, but it was built on practicality and duty, values he understood well. By the time he completed his medical degree in 1970, Harold Shipman was already the man he would be for the rest of his life, reserved, confident, and quietly ambitious. His professors described him as efficient and reliable, a student who followed every rule and questioned none. Yet beneath that polished surface, he had already learned something that few others in his field truly understood: the profound, silent power that medicine could hold over life and death. By the time he graduated, Harold Shipman already knew the power morphine could give and how quietly it could end a life. When Harold Shipman began his career as a young doctor in the early 1970s, he seemed like everything the British medical system needed. His first posting was at Pontefract General Infirmary in West Yorkshire, a busy district hospital where newly qualified doctors were expected to prove themselves through long hours and unshakable composure. Shipman thrived in that environment. He moved efficiently through wards, spoke little, and earned a reputation for being both capable and composed under pressure. His supervisors noted that he rarely asked for help, never took sick days, and often volunteered for extra shifts. It was a performance of quiet perfection, the kind that earned admiration but concealed something else entirely. Years later, an inquiry would suggest that some of the unexplained deaths during his time at Pontefract might have been more than coincidences. But in the early 1970s, no one suspected a thing. Then, in 1974, he accepted a new position as a general practitioner in the market town of Todmorden, nestled in the Pennine Hills of Lancashire. The town was small, friendly, and proud of its community doctors, and Shipman fit in quickly. He worked long hours, made frequent home visits, and gained the admiration of both patients and colleagues. But behind that image, the strain of his perfection was taking its toll. Somewhere between the house calls and late-night hospital rounds, he started using pethidine, a powerful opioid painkiller. At first, it was just to calm his nerves after a long day. Then it became something he couldn't control. He began self-injecting, convincing himself it was harmless, just a way to manage the tension of endless responsibility. The drug dulled the fatigue and gave him focus, but soon he needed it more often. He started writing prescriptions in other people's names, patients who didn't exist or who no longer needed the medication. By 1975, the deception began to unravel. A local pharmacist noticed something strange. Shipman's name appeared on far more pethidine prescriptions than any other doctor in the practice. Suspicious, the pharmacist reported it to the authorities. Soon, police began investigating, uncovering a pattern of forged prescriptions written in the names of patients who had never received the drugs. When confronted, Shipman initially denied everything, maintaining his calm, professional tone even as evidence piled up. But when his home was searched, officers found vials of pethidine and empty syringes hidden in drawers. He was charged with forging prescriptions and illegally obtaining controlled substances. The case shocked his colleagues. Many couldn't reconcile the image of their dependable, mild-mannered co-worker with the addict now standing before a disciplinary panel. In court, he admitted to his addiction, claiming it had begun after a knee injury for which he had been prescribed pain relief. Whether true or not, the explanation seemed plausible enough. The judge fined him £600, a considerable sum at the time, and ordered him to attend rehabilitation. He entered a treatment program in Yorkshire, where doctors described him as polite, intelligent, and fully cooperative. He completed the course successfully and was declared fit to return to work after a short suspension. On paper, he was rehabilitated, a doctor who had faced a personal struggle, conquered it, and learned from it. The medical council accepted his apology, and so did his new employers. When Harold Shipman walked back into medicine, it was as though nothing had happened. His record carried a minor blemish, but his demeanor was unchanged. He seemed calm, focused, and even more determined to rebuild his image. Colleagues believed he was a man who had learned a painful lesson and moved forward. He told colleagues he was cured, and for more than 20 years, everyone believed him. When Harold Shipman moved to Hyde, a quiet town on the outskirts of Greater Manchester, he arrived as a man seeking redemption. His past in Todmorden was behind him, his fine paid, his addiction supposedly cured. He was ready, as he often told people, to make a fresh start. In 1977, he joined the Donnybrook Medical Center, a busy group practice that served hundreds of patients across the area. By the early 1980s, Shipman wanted more independence. He left Donnybrook and opened his own solo practice at 21 Market Street, right in the center of Hyde. It was a modest building, painted white, with his name displayed neatly on a brass plate beside the door, Dr. H.F. Shipman, general practitioner. He was now his own boss, accountable to no one but himself, and that freedom gave him complete control over appointments, prescriptions, and crucially, death certifications. He visited patients at home, often elderly ones living alone. Many of them trusted him implicitly, giving him their keys and asking him to look in whenever he could. He kept meticulous handwritten records, which at the time gave the impression of diligence, but later became the perfect camouflage for manipulation. Local undertakers, Alan and Deborah Massey, began noticing something strange. They had worked in Hyde for years and were familiar with the town's usual pattern of deaths. But with Shipman's patients, things looked different. The bodies he certified often appeared unusually calm, sitting upright in chairs rather than lying in bed. And almost every time, he insisted that no post-mortem was necessary, saying that the cause was clear and natural. He would complete the paperwork swiftly, sometimes within hours, and recommend cremation. At first, the Masseys dismissed it as coincidence. After all, Shipman was one of the busiest doctors in Hyde. But as months turned into years, they noticed how often he appeared at the center of these cases. Then in March 1998, someone finally spoke up. Dr. Linda Reynolds, who worked at a nearby practice, had long felt that something wasn't right. Her own patients had family members who died under Shipman's care, and she began comparing notes. The consistency of his death rates combined with how frequently his patients were cremated seemed unusual. So she decided to take her concerns to Coroner John Pollard. Pollard agreed that the pattern warranted attention and alerted the Greater Manchester Police, who began a quiet investigation. Detectives reviewed records of 19 deaths certified by Shipman. They examined his medical notes, checked for unusual prescriptions, and even contacted the families of several patients. But they found nothing overtly suspicious. There were no visible marks of violence, no missing medications, and every death certificate appeared legally and medically sound. Shipman's composure during questioning only reinforced the impression that he was innocent. And after 3 weeks of review, the police concluded that there was no case to pursue. On April 17, 1998, the file was officially closed. Shipman had survived his first real test, and he knew it. The same calm authority that had made him so admired had now shielded him from suspicion. The system had failed to see what was right in front of it. In the following weeks, 3 more of his patients died, quietly in their own homes under his care. And by the summer of 1998, Harold Shipman felt untouchable until one family refused to stay quiet. Kathleen Grundy was 81 years old, but she was far from frail. She had been the former mayor of Hyde, still active in local charities, and known for her sharp mind and independence. On the morning of June 24, 1998, Shipman made one of his usual home visits to check on her. They spoke briefly in her sitting room, polite, routine, unremarkable. A few hours later, she was found dead on her sofa. Shipman was called immediately. When he arrived, he appeared calm and sympathetic, assuring the family that it was a peaceful passing. He filled out the death certificate on the spot, writing old age as the cause of death. There was no autopsy, no delay, and no reason for concern. The family accepted his word, as everyone did. But a few days later, Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff, received an unexpected letter from a local law firm. She is a solicitor herself, and she was puzzled. The letter referred to a new will her mother had supposedly made, leaving her entire estate, valued at nearly £400,000, to none other than Dr. Harold Shipman. Angela was stunned. Her mother had always been organized about legal matters, and her original will was stored safely in Angela's own office. She had never mentioned making changes, and certainly not one as drastic as this. When she opened the document, her confusion turned to disbelief. It was typed, something her mother would never have done. Angela later recalled that the document was riddled with errors and strange phrasing. It was typed, full of mistakes, she told her colleague, Brian Burgess. Mom always wrote by hand. She was meticulous about that sort of thing. The signature, too, didn't look right. It was shaky, uneven, unlike the confident penmanship Kathleen was known for. The more Angela looked at the document, the more convinced she became that it was fake. But the detail that disturbed her most was that 2 witnesses had signed it, people she didn't know. When she tracked them down, both confirmed they had been asked by Dr. Shipman to sign a document during a visit to his surgery. Neither of them knew what it was, and neither had met Kathleen Grundy. Angela's instincts as a lawyer and as a daughter told her something was terribly wrong. She remembered how her mother had seemed perfectly healthy just days before she died. There had been no sign of illness, no complaint of pain. And now there was a forged will, a hasty cremation, and the sudden involvement of the doctor who signed her death certificate. She contacted the police and she explained the suspicious will, the timing of her mother's death, and her belief that Dr. Shipman might have murdered her. Detectives in Greater Manchester Police began to take her claims seriously. The will itself was suspicious enough, but what stood out was the complete absence of medical explanation for Kathleen's sudden death. Shipman's record simply stated that she had died peacefully, without any cause beyond old age. Angela agreed to an exhumation, something few families ever have to face. The thought of disturbing her mother's grave was painful, but she knew it was the only way to uncover the truth. And so, in the early hours of August 1st, 1998, in Hyde Cemetery, a team of detectives arrived under the cover of darkness. They began to dig, and beneath the earth lay the body that would finally expose Harold Shipman's secret. The body was taken to a forensic lab for examination. When the results came back, even the investigators were stunned. Toxicologist Julie Evans, an expert in detecting poisons, reported what she called a massive level of morphine in Kathleen Grundy's body, far beyond anything that could have been given for medical pain relief. It was a fatal dose. The same drug Shipman had watched his mother receive as a teenager, and the one he had used on countless patients for decades. Detectives knew what this meant. Kathleen Grundy had been murdered, and now they had to find out how many others might have suffered the same fate. They moved quickly. Within days, officers searched Shipman's office at 21 Market Street. What they found there only deepened the suspicion. His typewriter matched the one used to forge Kathleen Grundy's will. Files on his patients had been altered, some of them edited after the patients had died. He had rewritten entries to make it appear that his victims had been ill for months, when in reality, most had been healthy and active right up until the day he visited them. And on September 7, 1998, police arrested Harold Shipman at his home. He appeared calm, almost detached, as he was led away in handcuffs. When questioned, he denied everything, insisting that Kathleen Grundy had died naturally and that the will was a misunderstanding. But the evidence was already piling up against him. The handwriting analysis confirmed the forgery, the morphine levels proved poisoning, and his medical records revealed years of quiet manipulation. The investigation widened immediately. Detectives began reviewing every death he had certified over the years, focusing on elderly patients who had died suddenly under his care. They requested pharmacy logs, looking for unusual prescription patterns, and they found them. Shipman had been writing out large quantities of diamorphine, medical-grade morphine, often under the names of patients who no longer needed it or who were already dead. Even more disturbing, the police discovered a trail of fake medical entries, all written to support his false diagnoses and justify his access to opioids. It was clear that Shipman had perfected a system that let him kill with ease and erase his tracks just as efficiently. Still, many in Hyde couldn't accept it. They gathered outside his surgery, some angry, others confused, all of them struggling to reconcile the kind doctor they knew with the accusations now filling the newspapers. It was easier to believe that the police had made a mistake than to imagine that their own doctor, the man who had treated their families for years, might be a murderer. But inside the police headquarters, the picture was becoming horrifyingly clear. Kathleen Grundy's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was the thread that, once pulled, began to unravel 2 decades of deception. And as detectives combed through thousands of pages of records, one truth emerged. The further they looked, the more bodies they found. The police identified 15 priority cases for immediate review, 9 burials and 6 cremations. Each one involved patients who had died suddenly under Shipman's care with the same calm explanations: heart failure, stroke, or simply old age. The deaths seemed ordinary on paper, but the circumstances were far too similar to ignore. So the process began, one exhumation after another. Families who had buried their loved ones months or even years earlier were contacted and asked to give consent. It was a painful request, but most agreed, desperate to know the truth. Each body told the same story. Toxicology reports revealed lethal doses of morphine or diamorphine, injected within hours of death. The consistency of the findings was disturbing. All victims had been killed by the very doctor they trusted to save them. Each name on the list revealed another quiet tragedy. There was Winifred Meller, who had been chatting with neighbors the morning she died. Shipman visited her at home, and an hour later she was gone. He signed her death certificate claiming coronary thrombosis. But when her body was exhumed, morphine was found in her system. Pamela Hillier, Jean Lilly, Bianca Pomfret, and Maureen Ward followed the same grim pattern. Each had been visited by Shipman hours before their deaths, and each had morphine levels far exceeding any therapeutic dose. The deeper the police looked, the clearer the picture became. Shipman had developed a system of killing so organized that it went unnoticed for over 20 years. He chose victims who trusted him implicitly, mostly elderly women, often living alone, and he struck when no one was around. He'd inject them with diamorphine, wait for the drug to take effect, and then quietly pronounce them dead. Afterward, he would fill in their records, add fake symptoms, and complete the paperwork with his usual precision. What started as a single suspicious death was now unraveling into a timeline that stretched back decades, possibly as far as 1971, when Shipman was still a young doctor at Pontefract General. Detectives cross-checked every certificate he had signed since then, every patient he had declared dead, and the numbers were staggering. By the end of 1999, the evidence was overwhelming, and Britain was preparing for a trial unlike any in its history. When Harold Shipman's trial opened at Preston Crown Court in October 1999, the entire country was watching. For months, newspapers had been filled with headlines about the trusted doctor accused of killing his own patients. And now, for the first time, the man known simply as Dr. Shipman would face the families whose lives he had destroyed. He was charged with 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, all linked to patients who had died under his care between 1995 and 1998. The courtroom was packed every morning. Journalists, relatives, investigators, and curious members of the public all gathered to witness a case unlike any Britain had ever seen. Shipman sat quietly in the dock, neatly dressed, expressionless, and calm. He looked every bit the professional doctor he had always been, and to those who had once trusted him, that composure was unsettling. Some of the victims' families said it felt like seeing a ghost. They remembered his soft voice and reassuring tone, the same man who had signed their parents' death certificates and handed them condolences. And now, he was being accused of murdering them. Each case was presented in painstaking detail. Kathleen Grundy, the wealthy widow whose forged will had triggered the inquiry, came first. The prosecution showed the jury how Shipman had typed the fake will, witnessed it under false pretenses, and then killed her with an overdose of morphine before signing her death certificate himself. Then came the others, elderly women and men who had died shortly after home visits with identical patterns of falsified medical notes and forged explanations. The defense team tried to cast doubt on the science. They claimed that the victims might have been self-medicating with morphine or other painkillers, and that some could have overdosed accidentally. They even suggested that certain patients, including Kathleen Grundy, might have been habitual morphine users. It was an audacious claim, one meant to plant just enough uncertainty in the jury's mind. But the prosecution was prepared. A forensic toxicologist presented the results of hair strand tests, which showed no trace of habitual morphine use in any of the victims. The data was undeniable. These were not addicts, and none of them had ever taken morphine before their deaths. The only person who had access to the drug, and the opportunity to administer it, was Harold Shipman. After nearly 3 months of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 6 days, weighing hundreds of documents and hours of forensic evidence. On the 31st of January 2000, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all 15 counts of murder and guilty of forgery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 4 additional years for forgery. The crowd in the gallery wept, not out of relief alone, but out of disbelief that such a man could have walked among them for so long, unchallenged and unseen. But even a life sentence couldn't answer the question everyone was asking: why? In the months after his sentencing, the government ordered a public inquiry to understand how Shipman had been able to operate unchecked for more than 2 decades. The inquiry was led by Dame Janet Smith, a high court judge known for her meticulous attention to evidence. Over several years, she and her team combed through thousands of medical records, death certificates, and patient statements. What they uncovered was staggering. The inquiry confirmed that at least 250 people had died at Shipman's hands, making him not just Britain's most prolific serial killer, but one of the deadliest in modern history. Some estimates suggested the real number could have been even higher, perhaps more than 300. Most of his victims were elderly women, often living alone, who had trusted him completely. Her report called for sweeping reforms. New death certification procedures were introduced, ensuring that every death would require independent verification before being approved. The cremation process was overhauled to prevent doctors from signing off alone. Hospitals and surgeries adopted stricter systems for recording and auditing controlled drug prescriptions, creating clear trails of accountability. The reforms reshaped how Britain monitored medical practice, all because one doctor had exploited the system so completely. While the inquiry reshaped public policy, Shipman himself was living a very different existence behind bars at Wakefield Prison. By all accounts, he remained calm and composed, keeping mostly to himself. Prison officers described him as polite but distant, always maintaining an air of superiority. He spent hours writing letters to his wife, Primrose, the woman who had stood by him through his trial. Over the years, he sent her about 25 letters, each one filled with personal reflections, but never a single word of confession. One of his cellmates later described a strange moment between them. The inmate, overwhelmed by despair, had tried to take his own life. Shipman, hearing the commotion, intervened and saved him. It was a rare glimpse of the healer he might once have been, but for many, it only deepened the paradox. How could a man capable of saving one life have taken so many others? Then, on the 13th of January 2004, at around 6 a.m., prison staff made a routine check of his cell. They found Shipman hanged in his room, a bedsheet tied carefully to the window bars. He had chosen the timing with his usual precision. He was due to turn 60 the following day. the exact age at which his wife would become eligible for his NHS pension. Investigators concluded that he had planned his death to ensure Primrose would be financially secure. Even in his final act, Harold Shipman had kept control over his fate, his narrative, and the last gesture of his carefully constructed life. And now we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have been done to stop Harold Shipman? Was there a moment, a single decision, a warning, a red flag, when someone could have stepped in before it was too late? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one of them, and your insight helps keep these conversations alive. Because stories like this aren't just about the past, they're about the systems and choices that still shape lives today. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you deeply researched, fact-driven, true crime stories told with clarity, care, and the emotional depth that every case deserves. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, stay alert,